This session is going to be chaired by Abel. Thank you very much. Except that I've got just a couple of things to say at the very start, which was around just a bit of an overview first of the activities we've done here in Queensland over the last few years. And it's going to be very, very brief because you're going to hear in a much more detail about those activities as we go through the day. In particular, in this session, and we'll be hearing from Seqwater, from Wayne Middleton, and Dimity perhaps as well. I'm not sure if you're going to... No, just Wayne, but Dimity is there for backup. Yafei Zoo, who's the guy talking from Melbourne, and then from the Gold Coast, from Caroline Stalker and Maryam Heshmat. Just a quick overview of where we started and where we've got to. This slide's a little... It sort of represents what's happened, and as Warren said, I think it was Warren, you know, we started back in 2012. Sandra, Fiona, Mark, Greg, Nick, a bunch of other people here were intimately involved with that start. And we can thank them for driving things so hard, and a whole bunch of tremendous research that was done over the first 4 years, that sort of period 2012 to 2016. And that underpinned an awful lot of what's come next, which is where I've perhaps been a bit more involved. I was just a 2-bit player in those first couple of years. In that period from 2016, 2017, we've transitioned, the CRC has transitioned from that really strong research phase to an adoption phase, which is where the projects that we're going to hear about today have come to the fore. And there's a lot of them that have been done. As I say, we'll hear about quite a few of those. But there was and I won't go into those at all, but there's also a whole bunch of others. I'm just going to briefly mention them so you get a bit of a feel for the things you're not hearing about today. We did some work for Queensland Reconstruction Authority on with a synthesis report called Ideas for Catalysing Flood Resilience. That was done in conjunction with James Davidson. There were 2 outputs from that. One, this report with those ideas about how we catalyse flood resilience, but also the guidelines that James produced for how you build flood resilience into residential houses. So some tremendous work there. The ideas work needs to be taken further forward, and that's sort of part of what Pete's doing now with the flood community of practice and in other forums. And of course that work of James Davidson has been bedded into a lot of what Brisbane City Council does now, but also in other jurisdictions. So a great piece of work. We did a review of how well bio-retention filters are working. There were a few myths floating around about that, with some contrary opinions. I think we've sort of answered the questions that were being thrown up there and given us confidence in that technology and in the continuing use of bio-retention filters. So that was a great piece of work. I was really pleased to chair a panel of some great people who helped with that. We worked with Urban Utilities and Brisbane City Council on risk-based planning, which was all around how we manage wet weather sewage overflows. Again, a tremendous piece of work, and I'm pleased to hear that that's being taken forward by both those organisations. We worked hard, and I think with the Queensland Regional Planning Group in at DISMIP on the SEQ Transitions project. It was one of the action items under the regional plan. Whilst that piece of work sort of struggled with traction, I think it's been really sort of the mantle to some extent has been grasped by Seqwater there and their partner panel, all the SEQ utilities, and that's what we're going to hear about from Wayne. We ran a series of seminars called the Happy Street seminars. The idea being that if you live in a livable place, urban sort of cooling is well managed, clean runoff, all those things, what a happy place to be. We did that with Len Lease out at Yarrabilba. Again, we'll hear a bit more about that, but the seminar series itself was a significant piece of work. It was all around sort of adoption, getting a broader cohort of people involved. And more recently with, God, I'm really bad with using Windows machines. Just sort of spins me out. More recently, we've done some tutorials on how we use the CRC tools. There's a huge amount of, God, now there's a ghost here, I think it's doing its own thing. There's a huge amount of work being put up on the website. I'll talk to the website a little bit later in terms of case studies that were compiled for Queensland. And we have now produced a legacy website or a knowledge platform. So that's a big bunch of work. I've been absolutely thrilled to be involved with that over the last few years. There's a couple of people in particular I want to mention who've been part of that journey and who aren't here today. Sam Lemons has come into that picture over the last couple of years. She's not here because she's about to have a baby. She told me yesterday she thinks it's coming early. So early that she can't come today. So we wish her well with that. Lorena, who many of you will remember was an absolute stalwart of the CRC here in Queensland. She's now working with Bank of Queensland and injecting discipline in there, the sort of discipline that nobody else except Lorena could inject. She was absolutely fundamental to a lot of what we did. And of course, Barry Ball, who was one of the reasons I came to work for the CRC, a tremendous mentor, part of the Queensland water industry for a long, long time. It's a pity he's not here today. I'm sure many of you have been touched by Barry's words of wisdom and sort of strategic nudges, and you're sometimes left scratching your head wondering, what did Barry say that or that? And after a while you realise he might have said something else, but it was very, very good. Just took... Most of us are just not quick enough to catch on to where he's really going. So, yeah, I'm certainly blessed to have worked with Barry. I'll leave it at that for now. That's just that quick overview that I promised I'd do, and introduce Abel, who'll chair this next session.
That applause was for you, Chris, not me. Okay, I thought I might just sort of break it up a little bit because there's a lot to take. But here's a simple question for you to just think about what water is, because at the heart of what we're trying to do and learn from today is, why is it so difficult doing anything in water? So here's the question. Water is A, B, C. D being all of the above? Okay. This is the reason why, because we do think globally, but we want to act locally. All of the above, because we do think globally, every one of those things is important. And we probably think all are equal because we do want water to fulfill a lot of things. But if you think of acting locally, one of those things does come first. And there is an order of priority. So the next papers that we're going to listen to, we're going to look at the big picture, not just from a CRC water-sensitive cities perspective, but also from each of the speakers, what's the big picture, but dive straight into something that they've really worked on at a local level that demonstrates that they've got this global thinking in mind. So those of you that might not have been around in 1984, I was, thinking globally and acting locally was what the Rio Conference came out with. It said that's why the Sustainable Development Goals talk about 17 different things. And the last one being cooperation, which is what the CRC was about, bringing those cooperative partnerships. So I'm going to kick off with Wayne. Welcome, Wayne, if you want to come up. And as you'd expect, I'm not going to do any work here. I'm just going to ask you some questions. Wayne's with Seqwater, but I'm going to ask him, what exactly is your day job, Wayne?
In my day job, I manage a team at SEQ Water called the Water Security Directions Team. Pretty funky name after our restructure, but what it really means is that we are responsible for delivering the 30-year Water Futures program for SEQ Water. So that's really trying to understand demand into the long term. So what does our water supply need to look like into the long term, with all of the uncertainties that may need to cater for. It is a regulated requirement of SEQ Water, so there is some legislation and regulation around that in terms of a compliance. And we also do the drought response plan. So we look far out, and then we look at what stress or shock on the system might look like from a drought perspective. And every 5 years we update that, unless there has been significant shock or change, and then we double back and have to update it again. But that's essentially what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I'll just take this opportunity to introduce Dimity, who's come with me today on the table down the back. Dimity's having fun this year in particular, because by June we have to have prepared our next water security program.
Yep.
For internal governance control, for then the regulator to have a look at by Christmas time. So huge piece of work coming together at the moment.
Okay, so just before I get you to speak then, Wayne, is it going to rain?
I think it is. Is that right? But it's sure not to be raining in the right spot.
Okay. Thanks, Wayne.
Could you use that to turn it on?
Yeah, just
That would
push
be
it
off.
up. Yeah, push it up.
Well, it was up.
Yeah.
I'm going to use this now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is that if you can speak closer to the microphone for the people online?
How's that?
Yes. Should be good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess this is crazy, these new world, isn't it? I thought that this might be the gathering in the long room today, but there may well be other people online listening too. So as an introduction, thank you very much for having SEQ Water along, and in particular the water security team, to give a bit of an oversight of some very exciting work that we're doing. You can see from the slide there, today we're talking about the water for SEQ, working together to deliver improved regional water outcomes. So by the end of the session, I would love for you to have been able to answer just 3 questions. So what is this? What is this new thinking and this new piece of work? Why is it so important? And in particular, what the journey ahead looks like, because it's far from finished. So what does that journey look like? I'm going to hit something here. I'll just use that. Thanks, Chris. So just in terms of setting the scene, and I've focused on challenges. So in developing the water security program, the last version, we assembled a panel of independent experts from around the country, all with their own, whether they were a desalination expert, a demand management expert, a drought response expert, and that helped in terms of developing some very technical thinking around specialised parts or aspects of the water industry. But this time, what we wanted to achieve was a lot more collaboration. So we wanted to work with our water service provider partners in the region. So by water service provider partners, I mean our customers, the people who buy water off us, which for the purpose of this is the utilities, so urban utilities, Unity Water, Redlands, Gold Coast and Logan. So we developed a partner panel to oversee and help us develop the water security program, so that what we were saying in terms of some of the challenges and the solutions had been ground tested, I guess, with this partner panel, and they would provide oversight, so that when SEQ Water, this is our water security program, we were able to say that our partners have been on that journey with us. What we actually found as we unpack some of these challenges, whether it's the complex water governance, which I'm sure you are all well aware of and could recognise, whether it's climate variability, whether it's the growing population, whether it's changing community sentiment and attitudes towards water, or whether it's the fact that our current regional plan, Shaping SEQ, really has not considered the impact that water has on underpinning economy or growth in our region. All of those were seen as very, very significant challenges, and for that reason we turned the partner panel into the Regional Planning Partner Panel. So this is an enduring group of senior water planners from the industry who will not only provide oversight to the water security program but will help with this Water for SEQ plan. So just a brief outline for the presentation. I'm going to provide an overview of what Water for SEQ is, focus on that collaboration approach, look at the vision that we've established plus our strategic objectives and initiatives, and then some next steps. So an overview. It is this sense of collaboration for best value. It's that sense that SEQ Water can't solve some of these long-term issues without considering the impact on our customers' customers and on their assets and on the whole water cycle. And that the way that we're governed and are set up at the moment here, that will require collaboration. That we want to share a vision for the water service industry, whether we're the bulk water treater and supplier or whether we're a wastewater treater. We want a collective vision for the industry. We want to establish strategic direction statements that help inform our own planning. This is not to replace the planning that we need to do as individual type organisations, but it will oversee, it will advise and guide our longer term planning. And we want to be ready for the next regional plan, so that when the SEQ regional plan is drafted for revision, there's a collective voice, an aligned voice of people in the water sector, in the SEQ water industry, ready to participate in those discussions. And at this stage, water and sewerage being the key pillar. It was developed by SEQ Water and their service providers, but as you'll see, there's a whole piece and a real intent for this to include all waters, including stormwater. So the approach, and Chris alluded to it. We met Chris, I couldn't even say when, but we met Chris as part of the follow-up of that current regional plan action and some work that Chris had been invited to do with the Water Service Provider Partnership. Dimity and I had been doing some work with the partnership as well around this need for collaboration and oversight, and the two just sort of fell in place, and it was great timing, and we sort of started this journey of engaging with the Water Sensitive Cities CRC to help us do our work, and hopefully was another way of helping drive some of the initiatives that were sitting in the regional plan. So we facilitated a series of workshops, which was in 2020, so no mean feat to facilitate lots and lots of workshops with lots of people from different organisations, all on Zoom, with facilitators up and down the country. And look, I'd just say it was an absolute credit and testament to the CRC, to the way they were facilitated, chaired, managed, administered. There was no way that we were able to, or we could have contemplated doing that piece of work. But not only was there that, I guess, that value, but there was also the experience and the coaching and guiding through the transitional cities piece in terms of the language we use and how we get us and our partners in that space where we can talk freely and openly about the challenges. So we did surveys. We were all encouraged to identify people from within our organisation who would be champions. So we had a comms manager and an asset planning manager, and so it wasn't just the water planning. We sort of widened that out as we went through this process. We then drafted the Water for SEQ plan, and then we went on the road and we started sharing it. And we went to the state government agencies, we went to our local government partners, and now we're widening that again to include other state government agencies, to Healthy Land and Water, to developers. So stage 2 of the engagement process is underway now. But importantly for us, the Water for SEQ plan was endorsed and very much approved by what we call the CEO partnership, so the CEOs of all of SEQ Water and the service provider partners. So the components or the artefacts to date, I guess, is that we are now doing annual reports. On all of our websites, you'll find the 2020 annual report. The 2019 annual report was an internal piece, but definitely now by 2020 we all felt that it was ready for public to be made publicly available, and it is. It's a snapshot of the work done in that year and the work to be done in following years. I guess the real, at the heart of the 2020 work was the ability to publish, and we're just about to share that, the vision and strategic direction statements that as a collective we've now developed. And we plan to actually publish a Water for SEQ plan around about 23 to align with what we currently believe might be the new shaping SEQ type timescale. Excuse me. So what were some of the benefits of Water for SEQ? What were the benefits that we sought as we set off? To increase collaboration, definitely, to share an understanding of our risks and opportunities, as various as they are, between us and our service provider partners. To increase our influence on the regional plan. To make some progress now on the water cycle planning or integrated water cycle planning across the region. To guide regulatory change. To develop regionally consistent approaches and assessment frameworks, whether that's about environmental benefit, whether that's about livability benefits, or whether that's about financial cost-sharing benefits. And I guess there is a real focus around improved environmental and wellbeing outcomes through this collaborative planning, and that would extend to catchments as well, of course. So as I said before, that's what we would love to see. We would love to see water and sewerage as a recognised pillar in the regional plan moving forward, that we understand how water fits in terms of providing livable communities, in terms of underpinning some of the goals and objectives of the regional plan around prosperity and well-being. So when we came up with the need, I think we were all very much on board for the need, but we said, what does our vision want to be? We wanted it to be relevant for the entire region. So not a Brisbane urban, dense urban type strategy. This is a vision for the entire region across both the built and the natural environments. We wanted it to be bold and fresh, a new way, that it manages all water resources in a way that we can demonstrate benefits, long-term benefits, both from an environmental or an economic, whatever that way we're assessing those benefits, that we have a very credible and robust assessment way of demonstrating those. That the vision's driven by an aligned set of objectives. It does consider the whole water cycle. Importantly, that it's adaptable, that it aligns with land use planning. And I guess that was one of the key pieces that we at SEQ Water recognised as we started this process, is that we're not actually close to that process. So some of the real value that councils and service providers bring to that is how they're planning for the actual demand and how that links into development planning and land use planning. And very importantly, that this is a piece of work that now starts to really create awareness of the one team, we are the water industry, and it starts to build trust in the work that we're all trying to do. So the vision. I'll just leave it there for a while. Hopefully that you can all see that. I guess I've just drawn out a few key words that, that resonate for me, and that this is now integrated and collaborative water cycle management. That's what this is. It's looking to build trust, that people trust an aligned water industry. That they may not see the SEQ water high-vis or the urban utilities truck, they might just see the water industry. And that the benefits and costs of this integrated and regional approach are realistic, they're measurable, and they're also pursued and shared. So that's the vision for SEQ. We've broken that out into 6 strategic directions. I'm not going to read all those out, but I would paraphrase those as the first one being about value and trust, the second one being about underpinning economy and economic growth, the third one being about collaboration, the fourth one being about integrated water cycle management, the fifth recognising how this fits in terms of lifestyle and well-being, and the sixth about catchment health. And we have prepared a strategic direction that we've all endorsed and approved within the Water for SEQ plan. We've developed 9 strategic initiatives. The strategic initiatives map to one or a few of the objectives. And again, there's words there that I'll leave you to read, but I would categorise them as the first being leadership. This is the opportunity to really drive and provide leadership in terms of that fully integrated water cycle management. The second is about that collaboration and us all working together to remove barriers that we can and should when we need to agree on certain outcomes. The third being about community engagement and recognising how important and how increasingly important that's becoming in terms of being able to establish social licence, particularly for our long-term strategy. The fourth, sharing knowledge, a real challenge for us, but one that is an early win and a no regrets, and one that we've very much started. The next about innovation. The next about decision making and tools and processes. So evidence and proof. The next, what do we really mean when we're looking for best value outcomes? Who's benefiting, who's paying, who else could benefit and who should else be paying? Those sort of discussions. The next one about updating and monitoring and recognising that this is and should be adaptable. And the final one about influencing our own stakeholders, influencing our government partners, influencing the community. So just some perceived challenges and barriers, I guess, to achieving this vision. I imagine we would recognise the inconsistent and sometimes tenuous arrangements that we have. That's not a particular feature of our region. That's just, you could go to many other regions and find the water cycle and ownership and accountability for parts of the water cycle broken up. Water and sewerage services are often considered late in the overall planning and development cycle. The level and visibility of leadership and the commitment required to achieve this vision, and we're reflecting on ourselves about how we step outside of our day-to-day and our compliance to how we really change the industry. Inconsistent priorities, focus and capacity across our businesses. A community disconnect, which we all recognise. We're all trying to improve and address, but we all recognise that our general community don't have a high level of awareness of the challenges we face and what we're trying to achieve. And we also recognise that we're still relying on that traditional business case development type cost-benefit analysis and trying to pigeonhole costs and benefits and without exploring what that might look like across a wider remit. So Water for SEQ in terms of engagement, we've touched on this in terms of engagement we've done already. Our real drive now is to continue to engage with more local governments. We have some presentations and discussions with Healthy Land and Water on the near horizon, and to continue to be ready and prepare for the next regional plan. And we've continued to meet and brief the planning teams within government on this work. And then in terms of next steps, well, again, we'll be looking to publish publicly our annual report for this year, but we will have started some pretty interesting work too. So before the end of this year, we will have done an issues paper. So really working out what are the issues at a detailed technical level that we're going to face, and how are we going to get better level of information or assess them. We're going to have completed a regional sewer and recycled water balance, recognising that we can paint a picture of the bulk water and water treatment network throughout SEQ. We have not seen a picture or a balance where we can actually say this is where all our wastewater and recycling and at a regional level. So that will be one outcome. Time? I'm nearly there. And then more implementation and alignment with stakeholders, and in particular, including ongoing endorsement and approval from our relative stakeholders, but the Strategy and Planning Committee and the CEO Partnership, and this is work that we see not as SEQ water work. This is work that we see as a collective, as the water service providers in South East Queensland. That's my time. That was perfectly judged. Any more information? Please, the annual report that I mentioned is online, and Dimity and I would be only too happy to take a call or email or a conversation over lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bertram. We will be having question and answers later. We'll move to the second paper. Dr. Yafei is going to be presenting from Melbourne. He's been looking at a different issue of heat and how his studies have helped inform what's happening in Queensland across different areas. But Yafei's experience is in modelling complex systems and complex programs relating to wetlands, waterways, fishways, drainage and so on. So he's looked at particularly the heat issues in Queensland. Have we got him online yet?
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Yafei from Water Technology. Today, I would like to present the heat modeling work I did with my colleagues, Malcolm and Christian, last year when I was working for the CRC. The Queensland Heat, Health and the Human Environment Project was a collaboration between the Department of Environment and Science and Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. The aim of the project was to provide scientific advice on the development of a coordinated cross-sectoral strategy to manage the increasing impacts of heat waves in Queensland. We have used the scenario 2 to map and analyze current and future extreme heat hazard for urban settlements across 10 regions identified by the Queensland government. In the next 10 minutes or so, I will briefly discuss the modeling methodology and provide some examples for the model outputs. The modeling project covered 10 regions across Queensland. It included 27 LGAs. There were 136 urban settlements were identified using geoscape data. The geoscape data is a digital dataset managed by the PSMA Australia. It provides digital representations of buildings, surface covers, and trees across Australia, which is important input data for the scenario 2. The size of the individual areas covered by the geoscape data ranging from 0.3 to 850 kilometers square. We had to split the large areas to smaller ones, and therefore we ended up with 159 areas to model. The project has used the target module from the scenario 2. I believe there should be another presentation or training session on the modules in the scenario 2. So I'm not going to talk too much about it here, but the target model is an urban heat island model, and it uses meteorological forces to calculate the air temperature and neighborhood at the neighborhood to precinct scale. In target model, ambient temperature is the most important force among other ones such as humidity, pressure, wind, and radiations. For the climate change scenarios, we have extracted the long-term heat wave temperature from 11 downscaled climate models for Queensland. We looked at the future heat wave conditions for 2 emission projections, which are the RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. So this was done in a 20-year interval. To derive the temperature forcing data for the climate change scenarios, for each area, we first extracted the 20 hottest 3-day average periods from the nearest bomb temperature station. We then created a unit heat wave profile to mimic the characteristic temperature pattern during heat wave day. For any given period, the predicted heat wave peak temperature from the 11 downscaled climate models have very large variations. As such, we have picked the 75th, 90th, and 100th percentile heat wave peak temperature from the 11 models. So the 100th percentile one is actually effectively the worst heat wave peak temperature. To be conservative, we plug in the maximum, long-term minimum, and long-term mean temperature along with the heat wave peak temperature in the unit heat wave profile to produce a 3-day temperature time series, which was then used to force the target model. For each model, we had 30 scenarios to simulate, and we had a total of more than 4,700 simulations. The total size of the model results was about 350 gigabytes. We had to aggregate the results to the 27 LGAs in the end. You probably can imagine how much work and how tedious it was. From the model setup to post-processing, it could have not been possible without the scenario 2 API, which I think Christian will be talking about it in another session. Given this is this meant to be a very short presentation, I will only use cans as an example for the model outputs. But before we do that, I'd like to quickly introduce the Universal Thermal Climate Index (UTCI). It covers both heat stress and cold stress, but cold stress is not quite relevant to us in this case. Target use UTCI to determine the impact of a heat wave. It is a measure of how human body feel the ambient temperature. It is affected by the actual air temperature, radiation, humidity, and wind. For example, you feel warm in sunny winter days. You may experience more heat stress in humid environment, even if the actual temperature is not that high. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see the predicted change in UTCI distribution over time in Cairns region. The areas under each curve represents what portion of the region fall within a heat stress category. These plots are the worst scenarios for RCP 4.5 and 8.5. For example, in 1995, about 90% of Cairns could be classified as a strong heat high in a typical heatwave event. The curves shift gradually towards higher heat stress categories in the next 100 years. By year 2090, about 50% of Cairns will be classified as a strong heat low, a very strong heat low for RCP 4.5. Well, pretty much entire Cairns will enter very strong heat category by 2090 during a heat wave event for RCP 8.5. This slide is a mapping for the UTCI increase projection since 1995. This is for the worst RCP 8.5 scenarios. The increase in the UTCI by 2030 and 2050 seem to be more uniform across Cairns. On the other hand, by year 2090, I'm not sure if you can see that clearly, but by year 2090, climate change is likely to induce more severe heat wave condition in the southern part of Cairns compared to the north. The Department of Environment and Science is still working on the translation of the model results to heat management strategy, which is something hopefully we are going to see in the near future. This is almost end. To summarize, we have used this scenario 2 to evaluate extreme heat hazard for a very large area. This couldn't have been done without the scenario 2 API. The scenario 2 is able to predict future heatwave conditions under climate change scenarios using the UTCI as a more meaningful metric for human health impacts. Last but not least, high-resolution heat hazard mapping can provide decision makers with essential information for risk reduction and community resilience plans. This is the end of my presentation. I think there will be a QA session after this or later, but in case there isn't one and you do have any question about the modeling methodology, please feel free to drop me or Malcolm an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Yafei. Greatly appreciated. I think we are beginning to get a message now. It's going to get warmer. We'll move to the next presentation from Gold Coast City Council. Carolyn, Stalker and Maryam are going to be doing a joint presentation. Again, I'll get you to answer a couple of questions by way of introduction, please. So if you'd like to come up. Yeah. So Maryam's with Gold Coast Water, part of Gold Coast City Council, and Carolyn Stalker's with ARUP. So Maryam, yes. I'll give you the microphone. Thank you. Thanks very much again. We caught up briefly about something exciting that's going on, and I think you're going to be talking about that. But what led to that whole journey for you?
That's my presentation.
Okay. And you'll also be talking about the journey itself?
Absolutely. So I'll be talking about the journey and Caroline will talk about the project. So
okay. So the questions will be answered.
I could dodge the bullet.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes, thank you. right. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and share our story with you. I was just asked to talk a little louder. All right. I'm Maryam Heshmat from City of Gold Coast. So where I sit in the business is within the water and waste business. Our water and waste business is quite unique. We had a couple of amalgamations recently in the council. So we now look after water, sewerage, solid waste, energy for the whole city, as well as catchments and waterways management. So all under the same directorate. That has given us a lot of opportunities. So we're very excited to see how that will pan out. So about 2 weeks ago, I guess, Chris was talking to me and Caroline and was telling us what his vision for this session was. And he asked me to talk about the journey and go back a bit in history of the last 4 or 5 years, what we've been doing, how did we got here, and hopefully through some of the questions to talk about what's next. Just reflecting back, I really think it all started with our purpose statement in the city. Our director one day came out of the blue and said, we are here to change our world. And he wrote it down because we were discussing what our purpose is, what's our vision, and he said, how about this? It did resonate with us, and it got all of us very excited. It's a very bold statement, isn't it? So this purpose statement did trigger a lot of actions that followed next. Essentially, we were asking ourselves, so why are we doing things the way we do it? How are we going to do it? What does it mean? What we need to do to achieve that statement, and how we're going to go about it. It's all those 3 elements we needed to work out. Some people might say, hey, this is a very bold statement. Why the water business thinks they can actually change the world? If you think about it, though, especially in the context of Gold Coast, our city is all about water. Everywhere you look, our houses are surrounded with water, and this is our identity in the Gold Coast. This is why people live there. People want to play with water. People want to be surrounded, or they want to exist if water wasn't in Gold Coast. It's connected directly to people's heart and how people associate themselves to the city and the town. Our ecosystem, which is very unique, relies on how we manage our water. And most importantly, our economy. It's all about our beaches and ocean and waterways and boating and fishing and you name it. Our hinterland, our greeneries. Our tourism won't exist, which is our number 1 means of living in Gold Coast. In terms of how we're going to change the world, I think if we can show how can it be done in a city like Gold Coast, the world has changed. COVID was the great example. We are all connected. If we can truly show how it can be done, then the rest of the world might use it as exemplary, and we might, through small actions, make a bigger difference in the world. So that's how we link our work and action with our purpose statement. So we had an ambition, then we needed to figure out how we're going to go about it. The framework that water-sensitive cities for transitioning pathways has developed is very structured. It really helps to leverage from that collaborative nature of planning for cities and our water cycle management and etc. So that's when we partnered with CRC for water-sensitive cities. That was about 3.5, 4 years ago now. And we brought together 72 people across the whole city to develop our water-sensitive cities vision. The water strategy was born. The water strategy, which has the 4 key layers of our waterways and health of our ecosystem, our nature, the innovation around our systems and infrastructure and how we go about those, then the design and how the city is shaped and how we create this blue and green environment, which actually create that cool, enjoyable place for people to live in. And most importantly, how are we going to partner to deliver this vision? Well, something was missing. In the surface, this strategy is led by the Directorate of Water and Waste, but in the heart, it's actually all about shaping the city. It's not about water. It talks about what the future city should look like. It's got economy in it. It's got everything in it. So what was missing was that overall vision and a strategy for how do we want the future of city to look like. And that's when we started to think to ourselves that we have created this, we have this complex system essentially to deal with, which is our cities. What is more complex than planning for a city, shaping the city, visioning for the city? But in order to deal with the complexity, we have separated the parts. And then we have created a massive system for each part. From transport to parks to water, sewage, stormwater, the city planning, and each part is doing their work in isolation and dealing with that complexity even by isolating the sub-parts even further. So even in the water and waste business, we can't actually align our work together, yet alone to take it to the city level. And it made us to think about the analogy of a soccer game, where any sports, each player needs to get better and better. They all have their own goals. They all have their vision. The goalkeeper should get better in goalkeeping, or the attack should get better. But it's all meaningless if they can't actually have the seamless language and harmony that ultimately scores the goal. So the same analogy, when thinking about the city, led us to think systems thinking approach is really that robust structure to shape our city. And this is the conversation we were having about it 2 years ago, and I remember my director said, we all know this is where we have to get to. I just don't know how you're going to do it. And my answer was, I have no idea how we're going to do it. But we can't afford not to try. And we've got to give it a go. I've got some ideas. In my head, it's all about maps. It's all about seeing things and helping people to come together and think. And that's where we're going to start. So 2 years ago, Water Sensitive Cities Conference in Brisbane, I was sitting here and there was this lady talking, and it just made me think, this is it. We need to talk to Caroline. So I talked to Chris and said, Chris, we need water sensitive cities. And we're thinking Caroline from ARUP and her thinking around how cities work together is what potentially could be the right partner for us to go about this work. At the time, in terms of where our head was, we were just seeing things as layers of information. Our natural city and how catchments and green corridors are connected or disconnected as a result of urban growth. Our urban densities, our growth, our population growth. How does that interact with our urban form? The infrastructure. How does transport link the city or disconnect the city? In the Gold Coast, one of our key challenges is west and east are quite disconnected with our canal estates. And then we have these massive north-south linkages. Then how can we actually create that in the future? Water and sewage, obviously. Why water and sewage is so important? Because we got the money. In the city, that's where the source of revenue comes from. That's the reality. When we talk about spending $500 million to discharge this beautiful treated recycled water into the ocean, then it raises all these questions. How can we actually avoid that? And what does it mean if we divert that $500 million and invested back to creating cycling and creating walkways for people, creating green corridors, etc. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline to tell us all about the city shaping project.
Thanks, Maryam. I'm just a bit shorter than Maryam. I just need to lower things. So look, it's been a terrific privilege working with Maryam and with Chris on this project. I'm an architect and an urban designer, and I lead the Australasian Architecture and Urban Design team at ARUP. And so this has been a beautiful project for us to be involved in because it really speaks to our passions around sustainability and sustainable city making. So as Maryam has so adroitly pointed out already, the Gold Coast is a city that's all about water. The economic lifeblood of the city is based on its presence in nature and in water, and that's a really key kind of underpinning aspect of the city. And so moving forward, we really needed to think about the shape of the whole city around all of those layers and systems that Maryam spoke about. But of course, that's not a simple thing to do. And, it requires a kind of an approach and thinking about all of these different complex layers that interact over time and in space as well. And on top of that, we had a group of people who we were collaborating with to do this piece of thinking. So you couldn't just kind of do it intuitively. You needed some kind of framework for approaching the sheer complexity of what we had set out to do, which was a city shaping exercise for a water-sensitive city. So we developed a pretty simple framework as a way of kind of allocating ideas and structuring ideas, which was on the one axis spatial elements that would shape the city, and the elements that worked over the dimensions of time, now being things that we were doing right now and that we could affect now, new being best practice and new thinking that we could start to implement over time, and next being the ultimate city shaping goal that we're all working towards. And so if you see these things over these three dimensions of time, you start to get something that you can enact over a longer period. It was incredibly important, of course, that we understand how all of the existing systems in the city interact. And so we did quite a lot of detailed mapping. I find this kind of stuff very, very useful. You can almost squint your eyes and see the big structural elements that are driving the shape of the city. And of course, the Gold Coast city is a set of linear villages with a broken green and blue network that moves across it. And that's a very simple characterisation of a very complex set of circumstances, but it actually helps you think about, well, what's the shape in the future? So really then that became our foundation for how we needed to think about the ultimate shape of the city and then work back to all the pieces that we could achieve over coming years to form the framework. So we've got these, the settlement pattern on the one hand and the blue and green corridors travelling east-west on the other hand. So that led to the very simple idea that Gold Coast had been, planners and architects in Gold Coast had been tossing around for a while, and we really jumped on, was this notion of an urban ladder. So that in order to create a more sustainable ecological structure for the city, we really needed to think about this notion of a blue-green ladder that crisscrossed the linear corridor of the Gold Coast. So that became a kind of a key anchoring idea for this spatial framework that we could build on. So it's all very well to have long-term goals, but unless they resonate with what's actually happening on the ground now, it's going to be a lot harder to get there. So we spent quite some effort in mapping the current projects that Gold Coast had on their book across all of those 5 areas in terms of planning and infrastructure and sewerage and transport, and found that in each project there was an opportunity for us to intervene and affect the water-sensitive outcomes. Some of them were longer ranging, some of them were about to be implemented, but that also gave shape to the strategy. So it was a combination of that long-term structural idea combined with this, what are the opportunities right now, and let's bring these together. So that gave rise to our final, our ultimate spatial map, which is really something, as I said, that brings together our opportunities now, our best practice, and then the ultimate shape of the city that we were looking for, which was about this ladder of blue-green corridors connecting to and crisscrossing across the primary settlement pattern, north-south settlement pattern. And to achieve that ultimate shape across those dimensions of time, we developed 3 key initiatives and grouped all of the actions, I guess, under these 3 key initiatives. So the first thing is we actually had to create and rebuild this blue-green ladder because it was very broken and very fractured, and we needed to kind of embed that firmly in the urban footprint and the structure of the city. Secondly, we needed to catalyse green growth within that corridor to try and find the opportunities short term to build those connections wherever we could. And thirdly, coming back to the big climate change challenges of a city like the Gold Coast on the water, we needed to develop a longer term strategy for protecting this structure and the city itself. So I'm just going to take you for a walk, a high-level summary of the main strategies around those 3 key initiatives. So in the and of course, as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of technical content that sits behind each one of them. I'm not going to go into any detail. I'm just really going to cover off on the main ideas and strategies. So the first initiative, rebuilding this blue-green ladder, we needed to focus on mending those ecological links and, of course, the ecological and water health. Very carefully framing urban consolidation around that to shape new growth areas, and then really using those community links, those blue-green links as meaningful community resources so that they remained in the urban structure over time. So we drilled down into each one of those, identified areas where we could rebuild those urban links, those ecological links, those water and ecological links that would mend the network. And then we identified areas where we mapped and identified areas where we could create new active transport and new community recreation links to really inscribe those meaningful spaces within the city over the long term. Then, very, very carefully, look at wrapping consolidated areas to frame these ecological links, partly to kind of bake them into the city, but also to look at that reshaped structure of the city over the long period and saying, let's actually make this experience of green and experience of water and connection to nature and ecology still part of what it means to live in the Gold Coast, but orient that in a different way. So, of course, this has to be done incredibly carefully with a lot of control and a lot of consideration, but that's the high-level strategy. So the second initiative was to go back out of the hinterland and those green links and look at the fabric that exists in the Gold Coast at the moment and really try and find the opportunities to create green infill, retrofit streetscapes and look at small pocket water regeneration projects. And the elements of that were within some centres planning that the city was doing. So this was more about the low-hanging fruit and trying to influence what the city's doing currently. So there was a number of urban growth infill areas that they'd identified, and the framework comes in and says, well, here's some approaches that bring water and water-sensitive city shaping to the fore in those projects that you're already doing. Of course, Gold Coast canals are going to continue to be an issue for that city over a longer period, and the water quality in those was something that we felt we could directly improve and intervene in, and as well as increase public access of and enjoyment of some of those canal spaces as well. And thirdly, things like streetscape, public realm, water-sensitive urban design, smaller scale parks around the edges of the canal, exemplary green development in those existing urban areas. So a suite of strategies throughout that existing footprint area. And then thirdly, the longer term one about growing resilience. And of course the city is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise, the impacts of sea level rise, soil salinity, heat, severe weather, all of those above. And I guess we were very interested in saying, if we have a framework for the city that's about water sensitive and ecological health, we really need one that's about a similarly holistic framework that's about climate change. There were some strategies, but we were really promoting the idea that it needed to be completely integrated interdisciplinary strategy, and particularly focusing on the coastal areas and vulnerable coastal areas, but also in a couple of key vulnerable areas around the Yatala precinct. This was an incredible opportunity to really rethink how that area, which has got a lot of agriculture, industry, Ramsar wetland, you know, it's an absolute crucible for all of the kind of big impacts of climate change over time, taking a comprehensive master plan approach towards that as a longer term project. So there you go, whistle-stop tour of the Gold Coast Water City Design Strategy. I think Maryam had some closing comments. Maybe not. Any questions?
I'll leave it to questions if there are any questions at the time.
Actually, I might get you to come up and sit at the panel table.
We have a question here online, if I can start it. Yeah. So it says, what support other than money do they need from the Queensland government to implement this ambitious strategy? For instance, policy reform. And that was a question for Maryam.
Great question. For us to be able to start such a project, one thing I forgot to mention is we brought together for the first time in the city each player from each directorate. So this was a combination of a group called Enablers for shaping the city, and the representatives were the managers or executives in charge of that planning for that aspect of the city. Huge, biggest step. But the thing that's missing is the policy setting and the scheme at a Queensland level. So it's up to each city to see how they can push this thinking forward. If we had that strategic thinking from the state level or national level, things would have been much easier for us. Then we had to do it, not can do it or maybe do it, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Maryam.
Thank you.
We have a question from Mark Pascoe.
Yes, actually, I don't know if we should ask the speakers if they can show, if they should come so that they can see them.
To stand
Chris?
up, you mean?
Yeah, if you
Okay.
could stand up, sorry. Next time.
Both. Yeah. Yeah, I think we might have difficulty seeing anyone. I don't think this goes high enough.
No, I'll bend down. Maryam and Caroline, sorry, great presentation. What I was thinking about as you were presenting was how do you future-proof this fantastic strategy? And you would normally in a city environment incorporate in the city plan. So is that the plan, that this gets captured into the statutory process?
There are two elements to that question, Mark. One is we set the team together and we had a massive disruption. Actually, halfway through the project, half the members left the council. So we had to actually pause and rethink about it. The water-sensitive cities methodology always talks about the champions and how important and critical expanding that championship across the business is. And we were so busy and excited doing that we didn't realize that it's highly dependent on those individuals. So for the next step, what we're thinking is to expand that network to external, not just internal, but having key representatives, key stakeholders, so the work is not relying just on offices internal to the council. But second part of that is we've also got a couple of working groups that has been set up now. One of them is actually around what do we need to change in city plan. So we are actively working in identifying areas of the city plan that needs to be amended to ensure greening or green roofs or green buildings and all that thinking, the setbacks can be brought forward into that scheme. But it's a very rigorous, long process, unfortunately. It takes 5-6 years to be able to change one word in the city plan, which is...
I wouldn't mind adding to that too. And that's absolutely right. Part of it was directed towards the city plan, but one of the clever things about the way Maryam had set this up was that... getting all of these enablers on board was that it gave us a conduit into other areas of delivery in council. So yes, framework in city plan, detailed design guidelines to back it up, but then specific project frameworks that were coming out of the capital works funding budget as well. So the implementation element of the plan actually covered everything kind of from policy through to day-to-day delivery, not in a comprehensive way yet, kind of strategic level, but still trying to touch on all the business of council and the way that they deliver their services on the ground and changing the basic way that briefs are written, for instance, for capital works projects, that kind of level.
Sorry, can I just add to that again?
Please, would you like the microphone?
Another important element, I think, was that we did quite a bit of work looking at how the urban design, the sort of water initiatives actually fitted back into the council strategic plan, so because that sort of nested in, with the CEO and that sort of level, and so it's really, you've got to have these things going top to bottom or bottom to top, whichever way you look at it, and of course that's an ongoing process.
Any questions?
We need to wrap up soon.
I do have one question for Wayne. Particularly considering where we are now in the dynamics of a drought and the strategy, which is about the long term, how are you dealing with that conundrum of, you've got an urgent, immediate sort of situation, but you've also got the aspirational?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, because as we're, a lot of the learnings as we develop the water security program are showing it that we would approach a drought with some different strategies. Questions like, what level of water supply would we make available? What would be the minimum level of water supply that we would make available to a community like Brisbane in drought? Our current water security program gives guidance on that. It says a very little bit, but because of the nature of the system, because of the nature of our storages, for them to last a long time, we need to be at the very low levels providing low levels of water, but it does come at a big cost. So we've got this new thinking about how we might approach drought while we're in a drought. So I guess, Abel, there's two bits of work there. There's also a lot of work going on in terms of what would happen if we continued to see the storages decline now. What would be, like we have a drought, we have a current drought response plan. I guess the challenge is, when would we start to need to augment the supply to meet a higher level of demand, if that's what the community was wanting? Yeah, it's a great question, and we have separate teams in SEQ Water addressing both of those pieces of work. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Do note that Wayne and also Maryam and Carolyn will be available. And don't forget Yafei as well. If you have any further questions, please feel free to engage them in conversation. We will draw that to a close, but Chris has one important comment to make as something that might have been an oversight earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Abel. Yeah, look, I just was thinking there was one person I missed out who's not here, and that's Jörg Keller. So my apologies, Jörg.
Would you like to...
But Jörg's obviously been an integral part of this, and again, it's a pity he's not here today, but that's how it is. So thanks.
So please thank the speakers again.
So, we taking our seats? Or with these hybrid events, we need to keep on time. If you know me, I'm not normally on time, so... Right, good afternoon and welcome to this third session of the conference today. This session we're going to be looking at, now that the water sensitive cities vision is done, what are the urban design, the water servicing and the economic building blocks needed for the future? And we'll have 3 presentations today and I'll invite them up as they come. One of those presentations is online today. From Monash University. I'm Sandra Hall. I'm the manager of the Advanced Water Management Centre at University of Queensland, and the University of Queensland has been a very proud, essential participant in that CRC journey. We were there from the beginning and very happy to have housed the main headquarters for the CRC in Queensland. I'd like to welcome our first presenter to the stage floor this afternoon, Professor Stephen Kenway from my own team at UQ. I asked Steve what's one of those fondest memories of the CRC in this 9-year journey. And for Steve, he loved the synthesis workshops. He loved the energy and the solution-driven approach to those workshops. Please welcome Stephen.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And some in particular that were enjoyable were the Sydenham to Bankstown corridor, where there's a multi-billion-dollar development. And seeing the councils, they were very energised about largely impervious surface across the whole city, but lots of opportunity for improvement around the Cooks River in particular. So I think the focus of today's session evolved a little bit from around tools and case studies, and we've got another session on case studies this afternoon. So I've kind of got a blended presentation that I'll give half now and half with more focus on the detail of the case study. But my understanding is that this presentation really focuses on the building blocks of what happened in some of the integrated projects, and I can talk particularly about integrated research project number 4, which is about infill development. So firstly, I wanted to very much appreciate and acknowledge the team. So I'm not sure if you can see, but there was 4 universities: University of Queensland, Monash, UWA, and Melbourne University that contributed to this project. So Professor Nigel Bertram heading up the architects together with Professor Geoffrey London, where we had a water performance team focused at the University of Queensland, and Kerry Nice, one of Nigel Tapper's postdocs, did most of the urban heat and microclimate work. So Nigel will be presenting shortly on the urban design components. And we had a fantastic steering committee which stuck with us the whole way through for 3 years. I thought good on them, chaired by Melissa Bradley, who's an absolute champion of enthusiasm. And perhaps not surprisingly, and partly due to the drive coming from South Australia, Salisbury in Adelaide emerged as a case study for us after we looked at and screened 15 potential case studies. So in summary, this presentation, the Brisbane program, I'll focus on what is water performance analysis and the tools that we've used around that. How do we develop and apply it in the IRP4 project? Focus a little bit on the business case and how it can inform the business case, because many of the integrated case studies are heading in that direction, and where can more information be found. So briefly, what's happening in our suburbs and why do we need a project around infill? I don't know the exact statistic, but I've seen multiple times that 90%, or people from BCC can tell me more accurately, of the urban development in Brisbane will be infill. When we look at aerial photographs, and you probably see drones going up photographing this sort of thing all the time, that the current pattern of development is nearly all impervious. It's either tin or driveway or concrete. This is in Adelaide. This is in Brisbane recently, within the last 12 months. and that it's increasingly close to 100% impervious of the actual development site, leading to more runoff, contributing to downstream flooding, whether it's overland flow path or even more widely regional, the more it concentrates, urban heat, and loss of water security, and obviously impacting livability. For some time, we've been aware of the water cycle and the impacts of urbanisation on water-sensitive urban development. So we start with a natural water cycle, go back 300 years or whatever, where there was relatively little impervious surface. The urban water cycle, where you're losing water because you're pushing the stormwater and wastewater away faster. You've got to bring in centralised water. And water-sensitive urban design, which really moves to re-emulate the natural water cycle by recycling and also allowing more water to get into the soil to create water for vegetation and urban cooling, etc. So if I summarise, this is a great slide from the Healthy Waterways back maybe 10 years ago. And what I do like is that they consistently use blue arrows to represent the natural water cycle and orange arrows to represent the human influence or largely piped water cycle. So we use the same kind of philosophy. If I summarise the aim of the IRP4 project, we're not starting completely with pervious catchments. We're starting with the existing case, which might have a small number of households. That is moving to be more urbanised in future, shifting those ratios and flows of arrows. But how can we make our cities have closer to natural stormwater, closer to natural infiltration, reduce dependency on centralised water demand, and reduce wastewater flows, and improve livability? That's, I guess, a grand challenge for our cities and urban design. And we can think of that at a range of scale, from the site scale to the precinct scale to the entire city. So in brief, the way that the IRP4 project developed, it had three main components, as I mentioned. It had the urban design, where the architectural team, and you'll hear significantly from Nigel Bertram, looked at simplified 3D schematics. We didn't need to know where windows and doors went, but we needed to know where impervious surfaces, where three-dimensional volumes, where water would be stored, etc., where there was green space, what the different vegetation types were. So I guess they developed through the Progress project and their previous project simplified architectural representations of dwellings, apartments, or streetscapes. And streetscapes keep coming up as a major network of impervious surface, which is owned by, it's in the public realm, so it can be part of the solution. So we need to consider the fraction of the road space that is being included in different design and development. We coupled that with a systematic water mass balance to interrogate and analyse each of the typologies, both at site scale and ultimately at precinct scale, for different performance criteria. I just briefly want to describe water mass balance, which is part of my favourite topic, or a key method underpinning the science of metabolism is mass balance. And it still uses a supply-demand balance. So a lot of people think of water balance as supply equals demand. And we always need to ensure that to make sure people can have water when they need it. But importantly, mass balance actually works on a three-dimensional volume. The dotted line is the urban system boundary that we characterise it above the households and above the vegetation canopy layer, a metre below the soil, so we can actually quantify every drop of water that flows into, out of, and stored within that three-dimensional volume. And that means every performance indicator that you look at for that volume, whether it's for an individual site or a precinct where defining the boundary gets harder, or a city where defining the boundary gets even harder, interrelate. They're all interrelating to a system. So when we're assessing performance of the system, it's the building, it's the impervious surfaces, it's the vegetation, it's the soil within that three-dimensional entity. How is it recycling or enabling optimal value of water? And this is a fundamentally new approach. You don't see it in any tools. I could put up a very detailed slide where Mojtaba, one of the PhD students, has gone through about 25 different urban models. Not all flows are included in just about any, except for aquacycle, which is a very good one at the precinct scale, which we've used for precinct. It was largely missing at the site scale, so we had to build a new tool to use for the site scale, building on music, algorithms into a visual basic enabled Excel sheet so that we could do daily water cycle and generate performance indicators. And so I guess just to clarify, we're not doing balances at the catchment scale unless the catchment of this system ends up falling at the catchment boundary. We're not doing it of the water network unless the network falls within that boundary. We're not doing it of pipes unless the pipes just happen to be within that boundary. And it's not of a two-dimensional space, which a lot of people relate it, even though we describe it as the site. So to, I guess, bring those concepts together into a site, and much of the development that we see is one block being split into two, or one into three, or one into four. And so to sort of bring those concepts together, the simplified architectural representation and the mass flow diagrams, we're saying, well, how do we assess the performance of this entity, which is the house in a three-dimensional volume, including its share of the road space? And I guess going to the business case and back to this mass balance figure, that those flows ultimately influence the demand for centralised water infrastructure, the rate that we have to shift towards new desalination plants, the rate that we have to upgrade the water pipes and the wastewater discharges. By looking at the increased volumes of stormwater, we use that as a surrogate of water quality, because larger volumes of stormwater are exporting more sediment and nutrient, etc., and shifts in the evapotranspiration impact urban cooling. How many minutes have I got left, roughly? Does anyone mind telling me? Just so I don't go over? Okay, great. Thank you. Perfect. I apologise for the small font. We're about to publish the final report. We'd hope the final report would be on the website. It's days away. We've got the cover I can show you. But in the reports, we've got the methodology and how the different tools we use to screen different typologies and ultimately precincts to enable the retrospective assessment of design. And so to a communication to build with the architectural team, so that they'd give us parameters on land area, impervious surface, volume stored, etc. And we'd give them back the performance indicators and say, why is that high, why is that low? And let the design iterate. One particularly important publication that IRP4 developed through this is the performance evaluation framework. We do have an evaluation process, which I'll mention shortly, but the important thing about this slide is it connects the design variables on the left-hand column with the performance criteria. So just going to perhaps what the community might want. They might want to not be flooded and not have a hot suburb, or have a green, cool suburb. There, over on the right-hand side, they're the things that the community want. But the design team would typically think of the brief around land areas or the vegetated surfaces, or etc. And then in the middle of that are the performance indicators. So around the hydrology, the volumes of storage, the volumes of stormwater flow, the quantities of evapotranspiration, through demand-supply balance, through urban heat and architectural and quality space, because obviously we've got to make sure both the interior of dwellings and the private space and the public space are also high-quality environments. And so we can use this framework to say, well, look, if we really want to improve heat or reduce flooding, follow it back in a cause and effect diagram to ultimately connect the design and the architecture. That performance framework is coded in the tools. And so the site scale urban water mass balance model, which we've called SUMBA, trying to keep in the CRC theme of music kind of oriented tools. And it actually incorporates many of the music daily water balance algorithms in the Visual Basic of Excel. Incorporates land surfaces, water demand, imported water, the water breakdown from centralised and decentralised systems, and most importantly, and quite differently, puts out the performance indicators in a very simple, easy to use way. That's published and released by the CRC as a downloadable free Excel sheet and user manual. It's also discussed in the evaluation framework. So the evaluation framework's been on the website for 9 or 12 months now, which runs through how do we use the various components of the project, how do we define the infill area. And it turns out actually defining the system that we're evaluating is one of the hardest steps, particularly at that interface of site scale and precinct scale. It's kind of easy when we know the urban footprint of a city, but this interface of what's the site, at the size, sort of between 1 and 5 hectares and maybe 5 buildings or 100 people, and a precinct. A lot of ambiguity, a lot of different opinions between disciplines, etc., nationally on that. Defining the parameters, selecting the performance criteria, and then actually assessing the performance. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the case study detail because we'll be presenting that more in the afternoon. But the final report, which we're producing, articulates very clearly the principles that are intended across both design, water and heat, the criteria for testing that, and the indicators. We articulate in detail the principles, and I'm just going to skip through this, and if it's of interest, you can join this afternoon. How to plot them in the consistent, I guess, with the Water Sensitive Cities framework, with good being development meeting the outer bound and less good, like business as usual, being red on the inner bound. We stepped through the case studies, how we actually developed and designed with the team to move from the existing case of 1,900 people in Salisbury, for example, through business as usual, 5,000, or conservative water sensitive with 5,000, or water sensitive maximum with 11,000 people, and what sort of water performance you could achieve with different design. So I won't run through all of that, other than to say that water sensitive, even water sensitive max, with double the business as usual population, can have less stormwater flow, with harvesting of rainwater and stormwater can also dramatically reduce demand on the centralised system. It can and be much more water self-sufficient. The more you're harvesting and storing it locally, not exporting it downstream, it can contribute to local water security. And we've got good data, good details on each of the 2 case studies, which I'll run through this afternoon. I apologise for flicking through, but briefly, we did these 2 quite different case studies. One in Salisbury, South Australia, which is a very low socioeconomic community, and part of the rationale there was very dry. They've been very progressive in stormwater harvesting for some time. So if we could make water sensitive development work in that low, in that particularly challenging environment, then it has a lot of sort of representativity elsewhere. Knutsford in Western Australia is more the top 10%, driven by the state development of Western Australia. And then a sort of partial case study, an integrated water study together with Brisbane City Council, which used some of the outcomes more in a local overland flow context. So we'll talk more about them in this afternoon. So to conclude, the key message is that our cities are not currently well designed from a water sense. We can show very clearly now how wasteful they are, and a lot of the first 3 years of our work with the CRC and the second tranche looked at that. They're very hydrologically wasteful and damaging. Systematic performance assessment across the natural, piped, centralised and decentralised systems quantifies the impacts and enables a much more complete and full business case. That was part of the topic of the integrated case studies this morning. Water sensitive design, both across the land use and built elements, can enable urban growth and population intensification and retain and improve the natural hydrology and create more livable forms. So that's a better return. So I think that's a strong component of the business case that we just haven't yet really worked out how to harvest. Principles and key factors to guide the site and precinct design are emerging, and local conditions are very important. The typologies or the designs perform very differently in different locations, particularly for the piped water supply. Technology plays a key role, particularly for managing increases in centralised flows. So if you are going to double and triple the population, managing supply of water and wastewater is a critical challenge in that. And the last one I like that actually, I think you know when the project is integrating well, is that a new language starts to emerge, that you stop saying what is this and what is that, and you know you have to write it down. And that's happened a couple of times now with both landscape planners and architects talking with engineers and modellers and microclimate scientists. So it's quite a big glossary. But I guess the point here that multidisciplinary collaboration is critical in this space. So more information, if you go to the CRC website, the 5 main industry-oriented publications are the evaluation framework, the typologies catalogue, the application of case studies in Salisbury and Knutsford. We've got the site scale tool, the AquaCycle tool with its user manual is already published that we use this at the site scale. At the precinct scale, we use a different tool. And the final report, which I can show you the cover, but you can't quite have yet. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So you're going to have an opportunity to ask our presenters some questions at the end. We're going to have a bit of a Q&A right at the end before a break today. I can't wait to actually see it in context and when you talk about the case study this afternoon. So we're going to give this a go again. Nigel, are you there?
Thank you very much to Matt for helping me with this new technology, and I apologise for that before. But if you can hopefully see the slides moving, then we're in business. As mentioned by Steve, the architectural team for IRP4 put together, we worked with this tool that we developed called the Typologies Catalogue, and that's a publication that's available on the CRC website. And the important things to point out about this is that they're not designs, but they're almost like a kind of spatial template. And they look not just at the buildings, but also the spaces between the buildings. And they're concerned with the quality, like a high quality, both public and private realm that act together. And that's important because often the buildings are considered in isolation from the landscape, or the public realm design is considered by a completely separate team than the building design. And as a holistic urban environment, what we're modelling is the whole total package. So the catalogue is filled up with examples of designs that we know work. So often built development is understood in a very abstract way, like in terms of setbacks and height and plot ratio and these kind of things. But we wanted to start with buildings that we actually wanted to start with the room and the garden and the courtyard and the tree, so that we can understand that the buildings that we're testing actually are performing at an interior level to maximise the livability and the efficient use of space. So here's an example of a small little terrace house in Salisbury, where it's a 3-bedroom house with a flexible ground floor home office. It's got a covered garage that links directly to a courtyard. The courtyard is well dimensioned. It's 4.5 metres wide, and it's directly opposite a north-facing living room, etc. There's enough space for bathrooms, kitchens, laundries. All the internal divisions are flexible. So this is an example of a kind of unit that, on this case, it's a 180 square metre block. We then can understand how that unit repeats at scale. If you had 3 or 4 of them in a row, what's it like? Does everyone still get their amenity and so on? And can you plant real trees in the spaces? And they're based on built precedent. And I thought I'd just explain how that was applied to a test case study in Norman Creek, which is just one of, it was aimed at the problem of urban infill in middle suburbs in Brisbane in general. And as you can see from this area, the catchment boundary in pink, and there's an overland flow path running right through the middle of a lot of private and public realm sites. Within that, another typical Brisbane condition is that there's a lot of pre-1946 Queenslander style raised timber houses, and they're the ones in grey. So we considered that they were not going to be developed in a scenario, and only the beige coloured ones were available development sites. As Steve mentioned, the typical business as usual development live applications at the time that BCC gave us were one such as this, where a single house on the left turns into 3 dwellings on the right, and the garden goes down to 20 or 21% from 70%. Or here on a corner site where a single dwelling goes into 5 or 6 dwellings, units, townhouses generally, and the green space again is down at 20 to 22%, and you'll see that the green space is in very thin strips around the perimeter of the site, so not so effective for the big trees as you can see in the old backyards. And we know that especially in Brisbane, or actually everywhere, the tree canopy is really important for microclimate around buildings and the general urban heat and amenity of our suburbs, particularly with climate change and an ageing population. So we took some different typologies from the catalogue that were designed for elsewhere and modified them to we thought would be appropriate. And then this one is a 2 to 3 level walk-up apartment building with an elevator on each core, so it's fully accessible. And it's a low height, so we knew it would fit in for infill situations. And on a site, it gets a high density over 2 to 3 levels, but because of the way it's organised with the cars separate to the dwellings, we can get the garden doubling from the business as usual development, even though the yield is higher. So we had at 43% garden area and permeable paving and so on. So we applied this model to a series of sites opposite the hospital in Norman Creek, you can see in grey here, one of which, or a couple of which, have the flood path hatched in blue that cross through them. These sites were part of an urban design framework that had a higher density strip and a new public green street opposite the hospital. And the 2 to 3 level height was within the planning constraints. And we thought as a test. And what it allows, you can see here in the section, there's a 3-level, 2 levels on the street with a 3rd level setback and the lower building behind. And the blue in these sections is an indication of the overland flow path level. What we did is we applied those sites for the model, and where the overland flow path crossed the sites, which were already developed sites, they're private land. We modified the typologies in this case to remove the ground floor so that no dwellings were within the flood path, and it enabled good pedestrian connection in a diagonal way from the street corner through to the large courtyard and down beyond. And we thought that this could also engender a mixed use type where maybe on the ground level allied health type functions might exist in a mixed use development with living above opposite the hospital. It would all work quite well. And you can see that in the section, that central courtyard allows for much bigger trees. We can have the water and the creekway, the natural creekway, which is the low point of the topography, having the largest trees, which is a natural condition, and the buildings are set around those landscape spaces. The second example is we took some townhouse types, 3-bedroom, 3-level townhouses, and a kind of 2-level with a rooftop elevated townhouse that we designed for projects in Melbourne. So we knew that that the overall efficiency of the dwelling was high and the amenity of each level worked. And we thought these would be applicable to other sites in our study area. So here you can see similar situation. The flow path is cutting across multiple private sites, and our subject area is here at the entrance to the park, where we've applied one type of townhouse on this site and another type on the other side. And we're getting up at a pretty high density, higher than business as usual development. So here in section, you can see that there was a small piece of public land next to the road, which we have large trees, and we borrow the amenity of this public space to use it to support high quality infill, which has the buildings well spaced apart, tight footprint buildings that have all their habitable levels well above the water plane, and allow for parking and some storage at times at the ground level. But importantly, those parking areas are designed as mixed-use workshop type spaces. You can see here the overall site plan showing the park, the council park leading into the larger creek reserve and wetland. And that supports an overall development of townhouses which have vehicle access but also central courtyards. So that you can see, I think, in this example, the combination of public realm and private realm landscapes working together to allow water circulation, pedestrian circulation, and high amenity for the occupants of the dwellings and the public realm functionality. So the total package is what's important, and that requires the buildings to have an efficient spatial footprint that can be multiplied and oriented in respect to public realm possibilities. Those same typologies were applied in different sites, and we utilised the fairly vertical character of the Brisbane suburb and the Brisbane trees to allow a raised, elevated type buildings that went up to 3 levels, but still could have numerous green spaces around them, so that privacy is moderated, and also taking into account the surrounding buildings are already quite high. In other areas, in the heritage areas, the development is much more modest. If anything, it's either retained at the existing building, or where the flood path crosses, maybe a relocation of that building on the site, or the redesign of it so that it could be a dividable house where 2 smaller apartments could exist under the one hip roof. So all of that meant that we can think of the infill precinct as, first of all, being partial, like it's never 100% coverage. In this case, the pre-1946 sites were largely excluded. It's also diverse. You can see the different colours represent the different building types, from apartments to townhouses to detached dwellings. The distribution of those different types is in response to other urban design criteria and where mixed-use retail and so forth and apartments might be. And so it's diverse, it's incomplete, it's in support of a larger environmental public realm idea, which is connectivity of green space, increasing the tree canopy along the natural watercourse and giving space for water to move. And it also is very efficient in that the total yield that comes out of this development is well above the target infill, the infill targets of the BCC. So here we had an increase of 2,000 people within this precinct. So that's, I can work out how to get out of this now. I hope that made sense, and I'd be happy to take any questions, and I hope the technology worked.
Thanks, Nigel. It did work. I wonder if you can hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Oh, good. Does anyone have a question for Nigel? Because we're running a little short on time. So while Nigel is still online, anybody? No? Everybody's a little bit sure. So there's general comments here, Nigel, that excellent work. Everyone really enjoyed your presentation. Steve had a question down the end there.
Steve Kenway's got a question
Maybe
for me.
I can... Yeah, I know. I'm not sure whether this is a stitch up. No, probably come here.
Nigel, comparing across the case study work that we've done, because this group just saw a presentation on Salisbury and a glimpse of what we did in Western Australia, and you presented the Norman Creek example here. How would you describe briefly the biggest challenge of the differences of those 3 different environments? South Australia in the lower socio-economic through Knutsford, higher, more technology focused, and then Brisbane. What are the biggest differences?
Steve, yeah, well, I think that obviously the economics in each case are very different, and the market expectations are different. I think that in this, I think the Norman Creek one, apart from the overland flow issues, which are only on those a certain percentage of sites, it's quite representative. It's probably the middle ground, and but on the other hand, Brisbane's unusual because of its topography and its traditional building stock. It's quite vertical compared to Melbourne and Adelaide. So Melbourne and Adelaide, the surrounding context is often very flat. So anything with height stands out quite a lot. So the challenge is always finding space for both high quality dwellings and high quality landscape. So it translates to how do you find rooms for trees to grow in, and that those trees are not only providing ecosystem services, but they're also adding to the living amenity. So they're well oriented. The trees are in the right spot in relation to the living room, for example, which is the very first slides that I showed. The challenge is also often around parking, because parking and trees are competing for the same space. So in most of our designs, we've got parking underneath or grouped along one end of the site. So not always sort of directly under or inside the house. And that opens up a lot more possibilities for good outcomes.
Thanks for that, Nigel. Diana, is there any online questions for Nigel there? No. So we'll let you go, Nigel. We're about to head into a break. And thank you very much for joining us in Queensland.
Sorry about the technology, guys. Okay.
Our 2.B speaker today is Syed Iftekhar from Griffith University. So 3 unis represented today, which is just awesome. When I said to Syed what's one of his fondest memories of the CRC, he said he's been really inspired by the way that the CRC has set up the advisory panels and the interaction with people to push the research forward in the right direction. And so please join with me in welcoming Syed to the presentation.
Thank you, Sandra, and welcome everyone to this presentation. I have a few slides, and I'm not going to talk about the whole of IRP to economic evaluation project. I'm basically going to talk about 2 main deliverables or main 2 tools that we have developed as part of the project, as well as some underlying theoretical principles and philosophies that we applied. This is coming from an economics background, so this might be a bit numbery and bit abstract for you, but please bear with me. To bring it into the real world, let me take a stock of hand, like how many of you are actually involved with decision-making process of actual real-world water projects or water-related projects? A few? Excellent. And in through our whole exercise and through the CRC's exercise, we have basically found out that when people talk about decision-making process, they usually talk about a formal kind of business case or formal decision-making process, but often they do not go to the full scale. Wow. I don't know, that's my laugh. Yeah, maybe we should. Okay, so it's actually happened in the morning as well in South Australia presentation with me. That's good. So when we talk about investment decision-making process, usually like either we are talking about cost effectiveness analysis, some sort of like where we have these benefits in terms of like physical benefits, like water quality or how many megaliters of water we have saved or how many kilograms of nitrogen we have removed from the stormwater, that kind of physical benefits. And then we try to find out the cheapest solution to achieve our target often. And then second one is on, sometimes we talk about benefit cost analysis, but in a very simplistic, simplified sense. We often talk about financial benefit cost analysis from the perspective of the organization itself. And then third one is, which is really uncommon to some extent so far, is do a full-blown comprehensive benefit cost analysis, which take account of the full benefits or cost to the whole of society, and look at the distribution of benefits and costs to different parties. So that's actually a real gap, and probably you will agree with me, especially those who have tried to push these kind of projects through the system. And you often realize that these projects often have this intangible or non-market or other types of benefits, not only pure physical benefits that we can easily measure. And then when we ignore those other benefits or the intangible benefits, all of a sudden we see that our projects are falling short because these benefits and costs are not stacking up, right? That's why when the Productivity Commission has conducted a comprehensive review last year, and they published last year, but the review was going through for a few years, they actually have identified 2 implementation challenges in this space. First of all, there is a lack of transparent and rigorous assessment of the options using cost-benefit analysis. Often, people relied on cost-effectiveness analysis or a financial kind of benefit-cost analysis. They did not go through all the way. So that's obviously a lacking they have identified. And second, which means that in absence of these robust processes, the decisions have not always been informed by the relative net benefits of different options. So these are, obviously, they have identified as key implementation challenges, and this is also something that the CRC, especially the Economic Evaluation Project, have been working on for the last 6 or 7 years so far. So what we have developed, and that's something I'm going to talk about, is that we developed a comprehensive benefit cost assessment framework, and then secondly is that how the data and the methodology of capturing the intangible benefits or the non-market benefits of these kind of projects. So intangible benefits are like externalities or something that's often not easy to measure in economic sense. To take you an example, like if we install a rain garden over here, it has a water quality benefit to the local waterways. It might have some benefits to the local fish, biodiversity, the water might look good. What is the price? How can we assign a value to that, the dollar values? Otherwise, if we cannot do that, then we have this unbalanced balance sheet, right? Cost and benefits are not weighing up. So these challenges is something comes from this practical reality that we often do not have any market, which means that we cannot just easily plug in these numbers from somewhere and enter into a benefit cost analysis. That's the basic challenge. So we often have to apply, like environmental economists have developed techniques called non-market valuation techniques, and that often used for assess or estimate these kind of intangible benefits. But they are also quite technical because you need lots of economics background, etc. So what we did as part of our CRC project is that we have developed a database, a curated, like well-checked database on these non-market values, or which we call it value tool. So we have the two things. One is this a benefit cost analysis framework package, and then secondly is this compilation of database or the value tools. So we call this as a package, they're called Infuse. Don't ask me all the names now, but it is an investment framework basically for water sensitive projects. So there are a couple of elements to these Infuse packages. First of all, like we recognize that not all of our target audience is going to do benefit cost analysis on their own. Often they will be the procurer, they will be the policymakers, ministers, or somebody who is advising to the minister. So they basically need to have an understanding of like what goes behind in these analysis. That's basically they need to understand, not much more than that. How you get the numbers, etc., that's not their job. So what we did is that we developed a guideline or a report, CRC report, especially targeting or facilitating this strategic decision making and how this benefit cost analysis or this economic framework could be helpful. Then secondly is this, we call it as a rough BCA, which is actually, this principle has been applied in New Zealand as well, and in some other cases in other countries. But this is basically like when we are sitting around the room, we are doing a workshop, and we basically very quick and dirty way to assess some options. Okay, it's more for a discussion starter kind of tool. Then we have all this comprehensive benefit cost analysis tool, which has these own guidelines, user guide, manuals, and lots of videos, help videos as well. And the 7 and 8 are the value tool or the database that I was talking about. There are also training videos, training materials, case study reports, etc. Chris will present as well application of this Infuse tool as we conducted. So in terms of our user groups, we have 4 main user groups, as I mentioned before. Large utilities and government agencies who often have their in-house economic expertise. Like they often do not have to rely on our standard Excel-based, spreadsheet-based benefit cost analysis tool. They have their own sophisticated tool. But often the lacking is these non-market values. So they use this database, they can use this database to plug these numbers or adjust these numbers and incorporate. Secondly, is the local organizations and smaller organizations who often do not have capacity. So they could benefit from applying our tools directly because they have some capacity, but with training and with support, they might have more capacity. Then consultants, of course, working in the economics space, they obviously can directly use this, and other types of engineering consultants as well, in collaboration with other economists, they can also apply these tools. And finally, researchers and academics, they obviously, if they're interested in this kind of research, they can apply these tools. So the benefit cost analysis tool, first of all, is I'll just show you the theoretical background of these things in totality. In a benefit cost analysis, it's like any standard benefit cost analysis. We have to think about a project or a policy or an intervention, but we have to think about two states, with and without that policy, or with and without that project. So we have certain levels of benefits, and which we have to be able to measure. For example, like what Stephen Kenway has shown through Zumba model or through other scenario planning tools, etc. We have to get these physical changes, expected physical changes, and the timeline, like whether there is a lag effect or if there is any benefits, like are you getting all the benefits at the beginning or etc. We also have to know that who are going to get the benefit, right? What is the population? What is the catchment area? So we have to define all these things. Second thing is that what are we actually going to do as part of the project? What kind of activities we are going to take? What kind of physical activities? Are we going to run an advertisement project? Are we going to go run a communication project? So all these things, activities, as a part of this project, we have to take account of those, right? And so this is benefit, this is cost. And then we have this some assumptions related to the, for example, discount rate, adoption, risk, etc. That's any standard benefit cost analysis you have to consider. But what is important, or what I like about this tool, is this distribution of benefits and costs to different parties, because that's when often these projects falls apart. Because they cannot negotiate, they cannot understand like who is going to pay for why, right? Like, so if you have this distribution, then you can clearly negotiate. It's not a decision-making tool, it's a negotiation tool, okay? So that's why it's really good, I think, and our users also have mentioned that. So once we have all this information in our hand, then we have to convert this into monetized benefits. So that's where the value tool comes in, the non-market value tool, as well as market prices. And then the cost also obviously are also all in dollar terms. So then the final outputs are, first of all, we get an overall benefits and cost ratios, and the net benefit. That tells us whether this project is good or not, okay? Compared to some other projects, or compared to not investing at all. Then secondly is that beneficiary or stakeholder level benefit cost ratios, especially from the project organization's perspective. Is it beneficial for the project organization itself or not for investing in this project? So that gives us a sense of equity, like what is the distribution of costs and benefits. And then finally is the sensitivity analysis about the robustness of our findings. The value tool is intangible benefits. It captures all these non-market values. So we conducted thorough research on the Australian studies. So far with the current version, we have 192 studies that have been recorded. In total, there are around 2,370 records. And we have also some value functions. We have the facilities for visualization of data. And then both database, the value tool, as well as the Excel spreadsheet-based tool, they are all in Excel spreadsheet because of our advice from our steering committee. This is the last slide. So the tools have been widely shared, as CRC has done with other tools as well. So far, it has been shared with more than 130 organizations. It has been reviewed by many organizations, it's been currently applied to many in real case studies and real decision making as well. So in terms of distribution of the organizations, government departments, councils, utilities, they are the largest users. So that would be all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Syed. I'm a bit disappointed it wasn't more numbery. You promised us numbers.
The urban water issue is a complex one, and I, being from a natural resource and strategic planning background, often think about this in an adaptive management context. And the councils and organisations that I've been working with over the last 3 or so years in application of the index work in these complex environments, and they're stuck in this adaptive management cycle. And it's an important part of what they do. And the index was really, started out being that tool to evaluate. And if you think about and know that adaptive management circle, there are these elements of, evaluating, reporting, assessing. And the index tool, as an assessment and benchmarking tool, did that. And I'm going to assume you kind of know enough about that, about the index. But it did also give us some visualisations that became really an important part of the communication, allowing you to communicate to senior executive teams and other stakeholders about this concept. So that's great, that's that part of the adaptive management. But where I think a lot of organisations are going to get the best value out of their application of this is when you start to think about its role in these other parts of the adaptive management. Being able to think about how do you understand the context that you're in? How do you actually start to identify where you might start to explore some solutions, which starts to sit into that planning part of the cycle. Being able to then identify some priorities and projects areas and thinking about linkages and objectives. The index itself can really help you do that as you start to unpack it. And when you add in those extra elements of the transition planning process, where you're really focused on looking at visions and strategic directions and understanding some of the barriers, you can really start to hone in and diagnose where you can start to put your value. So I think it is a tool from a management perspective that really used to its best scope is when you can really think about it in each of those different boxes. And I think those organisations who will get most out of the application of this particular tool and those other transition planning elements are the ones that are interested in actually actively looking for areas for continual improvement. So if you don't have something triggering the need to really ask these questions and then use those outputs, it's a bit of a lost opportunity. So where you've got councils and some of the ones I've been working with, they're reviewing their water strategies, they're reviewing their community or corporate plans, they're actually reviewing capacity building programs. So there's a little window of opportunity where you can go from asking questions to taking the outputs to actually influencing part of that adaptive and continual improvement cycle. And I think that's where you really do get the biggest reward from. The other thing that I've been using quite a bit of, which probably hasn't had quite as much hype in some parts of the CRC in use, is the Transition Dynamic Matrix, the TDF. And this is an element of looking not just at the indicators of what a water-sensitive city is, but it's actually understanding the enabling environment, looking at the organisational capacity to change. We hear a lot of people saying, look, we've got the right solutions, but why aren't we doing it? What's not working? And it's through the use of this, thinking about those different parts of champions and networks and if we've got the right policy environment, that I've found has been most rewarding to work with organisations to truly understand perhaps where the opportunities are and to really allow them those more technical elements to find their right home. So I think this one needs a little bit more work, but I found it an incredibly useful tool to look at these same issues a bit differently. And like the Water Sensitive City Index, this is a tool which really needs to work in parallel to really influence, again, each part of that adaptive management cycle. Cross-council collaboration is another area where we've been using the index, and it really prompts you to really think about, well, what's the right scale to apply the Water Sensitive City Index? There's been lots of different applications across the CRC work over the last 5-6 years. And the answer for me for this is, well, it needs to be the scale that's fit for purpose. And so that really forces you to think about, well, why are you doing it? Why are you interested in this? And for cross-council collaboration, it's forced groups, both in New South Wales that I've been working with, and we've started some of the conversation here, to really understand, well, why do you want to do it? Is it about just, feeling good about regional collaboration? Is it that you've got a regional planning opportunity that you need to come together on? Is it about a shared outcome? You're looking for better, flood management outcomes, or you've got a shared issue or problem. You might have very few resources, so you need to share them. You've got to look for efficiency and effectiveness. Or you're seeking a shared investment, so how do you do it well? So we've applied the index, which is usually done for a single organisation and was largely developed for that purpose, where we've applied the index tool at the same time with five organisations and 6 organisations in a separate application. And we've used that where there's been a number of smaller regional local government authorities that just need to work smarter and more collaboratively to survive and to be most efficient. I've also used it in a context where there's been an overarching water utility with multiple local governments underneath it. The way that we were doing that was really applying them in parallel. So whether you were in small table groups when we were doing it in person or in Zoom breakout rooms when we were using it virtually, we were able to actually allow individual conversations and then bring those people back together to think about the regional context. And it was a really important, I guess, conclusion that the regional score is not the average of what the individual LGA scores are. It's kind of what everyone expected it to be. But what's really interesting is you start to bring in very different stakeholders that are relevant to a much broader scale. And you think about state government. They're not particularly interested usually in any individual local council, but they are going to be interested in a much larger footprint. And they're different stakeholders, and they're going to bring different elements and context to that discussion. And so the context at the regional scale changes quite considerably, and we saw quite variation in some of those discussions. You need to stay really focused from a facilitation perspective on the purpose. We found some smaller councils just felt like they were dragging everyone down, and why are we bothering, and it's not fair. But really, if your purpose is about collaboration or planning or efficiency, you've got to stay really focused on that, and you do get a really good collaborative outcome. Time is what really is the trade-off here when you're trying to do 5 conversations and then bring it together for a second round of conversations times 34 indicators. And this is where these other elements, which are part of the kind of preferred process, including briefings and the pre-interviews and really good planning before and post the primary benchmarking, becomes really critical to really explore some of these other areas. And in my personal experience, the virtual processes have been just as effective and in some ways a lot easier to manage than the in-person ones. Primarily because I've got in charge of a mute button, I think. You don't lose people in the hallways. But, I think really if that's the reality for, people, and particularly in small regional areas, it's absolutely doable. And we're using similar, online platforms of Zoom and Mentimeter in a number of different benchmarking contexts. So indicator 2.5, briefly, who knows what it is? Indigenous, I did pre-record this, so you're getting the personal version. This is about Indigenous involvement in water planning. It's an area that, and I think it's the lowest indicator score for any council organisation that's ever done the benchmarking. It consistently comes up the lowest. We're talking 1s and 2s. And it's something that I've become quite passionate about in some of my other work. And it's a rapidly moving environment in Australia in terms of recognising First Nations and their role in water management, in land and sea management. And there's this empowerment around traditional owners not just being a stakeholder, recognising that their connections to land and sea country and water country, go far beyond that of what we think as a stakeholder. There's a shift in terms of what our requirements are, from a legislative perspective around the Native Title Act, around the new Queensland Human Rights Act and the Indigenous Land Use Agreements, or the ILUAs, which most organisations and councils have now, and very rarely actually come up in an urban context. So what First Nations people are telling me what they're really looking for is this issue of self-determination. It's about having their legitimate role at the same table as we have these conversations, and they're forever usually absent. I think there are some really good applications and examples to learn from around Australia and overseas, but I think an area that is doing it reasonably well at the moment is in that larger, river scale where you're dealing with issues of flows and hydrology and water allocation planning, particularly in some places like the Murray-Darling Basin. There's a couple of really great examples. It is hard and it is frustrating and it takes time, but none of those are excuses not to explore it more. And I think it's something that really needs to be a future, conversation. In terms of my own thoughts on the matter and improving this, it's an area that we all have to take that responsibility. It has to be about the relationship first, just as we would expect any relationship in this room. It's got to be about mutual trust and respect and willingness to genuinely engage. The prescribed body corporates, those that have native title permission to speak on behalf of traditional owners, are really your key organisations to start with. And there are lots of existing relationships that you can build off, and they don't have to be about water. They could be about anything, art, schools, education, jobs. I think the key is, though, that self-determination. It's not just about understanding cultural values and putting them in a little column at the side. That self-determination means different things to different groups, and you won't know what that is until you start to have that conversation. For them, the things that I keep hearing is that a healthy country is about a healthy community. Economic security is also about jobs and paying forward, giving back to their communities, having a flow-over effect back into positive outcomes. And again, that legitimate seat at a decision-making table that's mostly been taken away from them. So it is about being really targeted. Sometimes you need to duplicate your efforts. It requires a whole heap of other thinking and time and stakeholders, but again, not an excuse not to do it. So I guess in closing, my three kind of areas that I am left thinking about at this point after 9 years in the CRC is really to think about the support that's required for organisations that are dealing in these really complex environments. I look around and people I know from Brisbane City Council and other local governments, they're not just dealing with water, you're dealing with a whole range of other corporate planning issues and strategic outcomes. And it's not all that easy to keep building and putting water back in its place to have those conversations. So I think it's that role of how do we embed this into some of that policy and regulatory change, using adaptive management, and that continual improvement will be where some opportunities lie. But how? I'm working with a couple of organisations in New South Wales where even just doing a program logic, mapping this into their organisation is across 5 A3 sheets of paper. It's not easy. I think there's something about this transition dynamic framework, maybe a good name would be, a new name would start off well, but it is actually understanding some of these other barriers, and we talked about the 1.49 in the business case. That's not the problem anymore. So what are these other barriers that we still need to explore, and where are we investing in? Is it more tools and products? Is it actually in that organisational capacity building? And then I guess that last one is around the water sensitive city indicators and making sure that those indicators are relevant and meaningful, because things are going to keep changing. And I think even that example of Indigenous involvement in water management is an example where if I read the indicators in the index, they're not going to get us to the right place. So how do we actually keep having those conversations if that's a tool that's going to keep allowing us to improve the situation? I think that's just one example. There's a few others there where I now kind of go, a couple of years on, when do we start the review process? So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thanks everyone. And we didn't get too much direction on what to present here, so Fee's nodding ahead. But it was a great opportunity to kind of reflect, and as a director of a company, I guess it's the importance of having those linkages back to research is critical. And if I think about my colleagues, the directors and staff in each design lab, we kind of have it in our veins. A lot of us were working for the CRC for freshwater ecology, myself, or the CRC for catchment hydrology. We were part of a joint venture with Monash in Forb, the facility for advancing water biofiltration, and for the last 9 years being pretty active participants with the CRC Water Sensitive Cities. And look, if you've ever wondered what the lab is in our name, E2 Design Lab, well, it's there for a purpose, and it's to reflect that link back to research and also collaboration. And while working with researchers is great, we also collaborate as an industry, which is great. We're currently working with Alluvium on a really interesting sort of pilot project with Townsville City Council. We've worked with Water Technology, and we've worked with Tract as well on various projects we'll be presenting today as well. So when I was looking at the tools, we've been really fortunate in being able to, for some of the tools, help develop pilot tools, but then apply them in our day-to-day work. So there's quite a few, and I wasn't sure which ones to select, so I actually went out to my team and said, send me through some highlights and some key learnings. So this presentation is really going to be about, some of the insights that we've found by using and applying these tools. So I won't spend a lot of time on each of these because you've probably heard a lot about them, but I'll be touching on I guess those tools that help us see the vision of a water-sensitive city, planning and evaluation tools, and then some implementation. So, as Fee mentioned, this Water Sensitive Cities Index sort of benchmarking tool is really so valuable for us in getting the stakeholders together in a room and sharing knowledge and finding out where they're at. Because you can't plan forward without knowing what your starting point is. And we've rolled out the indexing for more than 12 LGAs in Melbourne and some LGAs in other states as well. And I guess from doing that, we found that many of the tools and instruments exist already to advance water-sensitive city practices. And the key really is in sharing these resources effectively across organisations. And so if you have a look at the spider diagram there, this one here, if you look at the combined outcome of for Australia, we're actually fairly well progressed. It's just that it doesn't necessarily all sit in one organisation, one LGA, but definitely there's the ability to share that knowledge. The transitions framework as well has been a useful tool to then say, well, what have you got in your organisation and where are the gaps? And as you can see, there's a diversity of how far the enabling factors are progressed within any LGA. But that's really important to know as well, because then it allows for that action planning. It gives those LGAs something tangible, outcomes to be able to progress forward. So on reflection, the Water Sensitive Cities Index has been applied, and we know that it can be applied not just in Australia, internationally, but also at a whole range of different scales. And while everyone's on sort of a different journey, overall we're actually making pretty good progress, and there's a lot that we can learn from each other in doing that. One of the really valuable outcomes was the importance of having the right people in the room and having people from across different departments within an LGA and external stakeholders like the utilities, and the value of just having all of those people in the room to share the knowledge and to support the ongoing conversations and collaboration is one of the great values that come out of it, let alone your spider diagrams and your visualizations. And we need to know what our strengths and weaknesses are to be able to progress forward. So moving on to sort of planning and options analysis. I guess the normal process you would go through is to understand your current condition and your site context, to develop up what your vision and objectives are for any one site, test scenarios and communicate the outcomes. But now as practitioners, we've got these great tools for stakeholder engagement, and that's the Water Sensitive Cities Scenario tool and the Infuse tool. And this is an example of just being able to use the tools to just understand current condition and to be able to really effectively communicate it. And so this is one that we're working on. It's a city scale example with Townsville City Council, and it really showed, where they could zone in if they wanted to target hotspots. It also gives really great information on water balance. But like any tool, it's only as good as the data and information that you put into it. So again, it's really critical to work closely with stakeholders and ensure, the data and assumptions are correct. And when they are, it's fantastic outcomes. And then you can use that as a basis to say, well, this is where you're at. There's areas that are really hot. If you continue to develop in the same way, they're going to remain hot. So it helps develop what they want out of it and what their visions and objectives really are. And then they can go forward and start using other tools such as the scenario tool to be able to test options. And the value of this tool, again, it's visual, it's easy to communicate, but it's relatively simple to apply, so you can run it with your stakeholders to say, if we apply this scenario, what are the outcomes? How does it change our water balance? How does it change our heat island indicators? And so you get those stakeholders involved in that decision process, and they get the buy-in as to why, you know, certain options will stack up better than others. It then goes, once they decide on an option, we can now use this Infuse tool, which is fantastic to be able to start putting costs to things that we couldn't normally cost. So we're not just talking about potable water savings or the cost to replace a tree, but we can start to factor in things like the cost of mortality or the benefits of avoided mortality by having cooler, greener, healthier environments. It also opens up those sometimes difficult conversations around, and it's been mentioned here today, around, well, who pays and who benefits? And where there's inequality there, then looking at, you know, different funding models, different ways to overcome and sort of look at different ways of actually getting these outcomes in a more fair and equitable manner. Most of the work when you use the Infuse tool actually happens before you use the tool. And that's, again, working with those stakeholders to understand what are those benefits that are most interest to them, what are the benefits that they value, and what are the costs associated with those. So again, it's that bringing together of people and having a collective understanding of, you know, what do we value and what do we want to put costs and benefits against. And it's only then, after those workshops, after that stakeholder engagement and collective understanding, that you use the tool to get your outcomes and your outputs. And again, I already mentioned that, you know, that using, being able to value the intangible makes it things stack up that wouldn't normally have stacked up. It's a much holistic and more accurate picture of the true benefit of water-sensitive cities approaches. And this is another example of application of the Infuse tool, but adapted a version called In a Nutshell that we helped develop. And this was an example for a stormwater harvesting scheme for Princes Park. So these tools are being used and are being really effective to communicate the benefits on real projects. And this is just one example where it's been used and showing that it did stack up. It's because it's you're able to test high-level concepts. This isn't a detailed business case, but it gives confidence to be able to take it forward into investment into more detailed business cases with economists and so forth. And then in terms of implementation, as well as doing kind of this foundational research, which is so critical, and building that into tools that the industry can use, the CRC has also been great at just capacity building and filling some of those gaps where there hasn't been resources available. And one example was the designing for a cool city, so guidelines for passively irrigated landscapes. And this was a really great guideline for us to work on, and we collaborated with Healthy Land and Water, Water by Design, and a whole range of LGAs in developing this piece of work. And definitely shout out to Chris Manning of Townsville City Council, who was really a key driver in progressing a lot of this knowledge base and guideline development. So the guidelines draw on, I guess, innovative projects that have been delivered, but then get that information back out so more people can take on that knowledge and start implementing these new technologies and new initiatives such as turf wicking systems. And I put this sort of a graph here because we use it so much, and being able to refer back to the core science and research that has been done gives even more confidence to what we're trying to communicate as industry practitioners. And in this case, just pointing out that dry grass can be as hot as a road on an extreme heat day. If you can irrigate it with alternative water sources, you get huge gains in reducing urban heat. So it's really a powerful message that we can use that research in. These guidelines also had a whole range of different solutions so that this new technology and approaches to achieving cooler, greener cities can be applied at different site conditions and in different situations. And that's just a few of the configurations that are possible. And it also has started to tailor it to different climatic regions as well. So at the back of this guideline, there's sizing guides for different climatic zones. So we've got quite a few covered off in Queensland, but we also have Adelaide, Sydney, and yeah. So these different climatic zones are really important because we want the implementation of these kind of technologies to be successful. So how do you size them to make sure, say, a passively watered tree isn't going to be too wet and the tree's going to drown, or too dry that it's not getting the full benefit of passive irrigation? So these are tools that are now available for the industry to not only undertake and implement some of these initiatives, but to try to get it right and get really good outcomes. So in terms of application, we've come a long way, I feel, but we're still on that journey and we're going to be continuing on that journey. It's great to see so many on-ground trials of, say, passively watered trees and other infrastructure. There's going to be continued learning, and that learning and sharing that learning as an industry is really important. And a reminder that best practice is a forward-moving target, and we should always be trying to get better outcomes and improved outcomes all the time and pushing the boundaries, and that's why that research and implementation is so critical. Celebrate and apply. So we should really celebrate all the hard work that the CRC has done, all those fantastic tools that have come out, but apply them, use them. And we're certainly doing that in our practice, but would love to be doing it more and more. They're such strong communication tools for us to be using. And new conversations and research. So certainly looking forward to what's next, continuing the great conversations with researchers, with the industry, and seeing what the future holds, and hopefully it's lots of water sensitive cities. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Right, in terms of celebrating, what perfect timing. You two women are role models, you know. You're both 15 minutes on the absolute knocker, so well done. And I want to celebrate both of your involvements in the CRC too, so really, really well done. Thank you both very much. Are there any, yeah, come on. Doesn't mean you blokes aren't going to get some celebration later on too. But, are there any questions for Sally up front that people may have?
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, everyone. Look, there's part of this presentation I will actually go off script based on the fact that we've actually covered off some elements through the day and through the interpretation of this afternoon session, and also noting that we're near the end of the day. Indeed, indeed. Look, the last few years I've actually been quite closely involved with the scenario tool from being chair of the steering committee and involved in a lot of the testing for the tool, amongst many other people that have been involved in that process. So what I'll be talking through today is a little bit more very specifically related to the scenario tool and how it can be actually applied and used into what we're doing today. Here we go. So it's going to look at why is it needed, what is it, what's that actually mean? A few times it's been mentioned, a few times it's actually been described in different ways, and importantly, how can it be used? How can it be applied to our context and what we're trying to achieve? What's the value that it actually brings to the decision-making process? And we're also going to be looking at where to from here and what's going to happen beyond the CRC. From a why is it needed, obviously there's an overarching complex arrangement of different things that are driving the need. In the development space, we've heard a lot about the complexity around decision making, population growth, constraints on the space available, infill development, what are the requirements for there, changes associated with the urban form and how that actually rolls out into what happens with the water at the site itself and beyond the site. So runoff implications, what are the infiltration contexts? How does it actually land into the space where we actually need to trade off one benefit against another? There's been a few presentations today that have actually talked about that cost-benefit side. But if you're actually looking at those different elements in a collaborative arrangement, how best can you actually navigate that space? Multiple dependencies, all within the context of a community. And a community that's obviously got different drivers based on the different space, different needs, different socioeconomic requirements. And then overarching that, we've obviously got climate change and the impacts that that's going to have now and into the future. Now, the scenario tool, one of the early forms actually focused a lot on urban heat and urban heat mitigation. One of the earlier projects that I did with Chris with the Arabilba project was mainly focused on the urban heat element. And a couple of years ago, that was a bit of a journey going through using the tool in that space, obviously navigating the different elements within a beta and in some respects an alpha form product. But it actually allowed you to actually understand that urban form in a different manner, and then trying to bring in some of the mitigation strategies that may be beneficial to work through. So, looking at the tool itself, it is a collaborative development planning tool used to rapidly visualise and compare different development scenarios. So being able to have a look at multiple different benefits and impacts, the mitigation strategies that you might be using, what are some of the planning outcomes and ideas that you need to be implementing. They also can be used in understanding the different blue-green strategies that may be being sought, whether that be a treed landscape, street trees, could be associated with water-sensitive urban design more specifically. It is a support tool. It's a planning support tool that can be used to understand how these different typologies that have been put forward, how they can actually change what we're doing in that landscape. So if you were looking at different footprints for a development, what are the outcomes associated with that? It allows you to bring in multiple different models. It's not just one model, so it's not just looking at heat, it's not just looking at water cycle, it's going to be bringing in a few together. It allows for that assessment and comparison. So the scenario tool is brought together with 4 main modules. Overarching is the urban development module. Sitting within that context is the extreme heat component, which is looking at extreme heat day events or sequences of events at that land surface scale. And then there is another component which is actually looking at thermal comfort. So that's the way we often experience an environment is not associated with what's the surface temperature of the road that you're walking on or the tree that you're standing next to. It's actually the ambient air around it. What are the implications for the environment that you're in? And then the final module that was brought into the scenario tool last year was the urban water cycle, which is bringing in that water balance component to actually help you underpin a lot of the strategies that are in place. One of the things that came up in some of our early Happy Streets sort of workshops were associated with what's happening, where's the water coming from? How does that actually, how can you actually justify that as an approach or a strategy? Bringing these modules all together actually allows you to investigate that at some level of detail and bring it forward in that discussion space. But there are limitations for any product, any modelling tool, and so I'll just give you a couple of broad ones. By default, it's looking at a certain scale, so typically at a 20-metre grid scale, although the current advanced version actually allows you to go finer resolution than that. It's not a detailed design tool, it's that conceptual design tool that allows you to actually investigate options, more like a gaming tool. And as Sally was pointing out before, it allows the opportunity to collaborate well together across disciplines, across sectors, to actually communicate in what would be understood as a more common language, to actually then investigate solutions and scenarios. But again, as has been pointed out, with any modelling, it's associated with what sort of quality of information you're putting in, results in the quality of information you're getting out. From a tool perspective, some people come into that modelling space with a particular avenue that they're familiar with. In this case, for water-sensitive urban design, it's not looking at every single permeation of water-sensitive design devices, but it does have a very large suite of those that actually can be considered and implemented within a scenario. So the process is very similar in that to many modelling processes, which is you use your data, you build your scenario, and then you analyse and compare those to actually understand where that's coming from. So there's various, sorry, on my side it's actually showing cool. I just thought I'd done a BHP thing, and there's a pop-up for virus checking. So often within many modelling projects, and particularly in the urban context, is actually getting the right data for the right sort of question that you're trying to answer. The scenario tool actually brings in a lot of that data for you. To actually overlay that into your problem is a really good help. So it has census data. It brings in your spatial layers and spatial elements, building footprints, land cover components, as well as bringing in obviously your climatic data that you need to actually run these simulations. And then there's a number of those elements that actually come through a third-party geoscape and used under licence. That information is available within the tool. But then you can also bring in your own data sets. So a lot of local governments will have really good solid data sets that bring in the built form itself, or may bring in other elements that are actually relevant to generating a model. It's built in a layered form, so it allows you to actually look at it from the infrastructure, from the urban form perspective, and from within that context that you're actually doing a model within a catchment itself. From an application perspective, we've actually heard today about a number of different applications of the tool itself, or actually some of those outcomes. Understanding the influence and the of blue-green infrastructure and how we actually apply that to mitigate against urban heat. What are the impacts and benefits associated with changes in microclimate? Investigating potential strategies for different urban heat mitigation, and obviously in that planning and design space. And in the water cycle area, from a conceptual component, it actually brings in a number of tools that actually both support understanding the individual site-specific components, but also in bringing together elements that actually help you communicate that to your audience or your other stakeholders within the project. So that urban water cycle allows you to bring in multiple different water management strategies, and they can be at multiple different scales. It could be from the lot scale through to the regional and catchment scale, or it can be in reverse. So you may actually start from the catchment scale and actually want to deep dive down into the lot scale. It has that flexibility that allows you to do that. And from a visual component, comparing and understanding differences between multiple different scenarios is something that has actually been set up for in the first place. So you can create, I think there was a presentation earlier from Yafei that actually talked about hundreds and thousands of replications. That's the sort of extreme end of where you can go, but even if you're looking at multiple individual projects, you can actually compare readily and quickly against each. If you're looking at a business as usual compared to a water-sensitive city option, what are the changes? What are the impacts associated with changing the impervious cover, irrigating a surface, or introducing an increased street tree cover. Now, moving forward, obviously at the end of the CRC, these tools don't just go out into the ether. They actually sit there, and as having been involved in a previous CRC that had generated multiple different outputs, and then understanding where they actually get to, looking back almost 10 years later, is really interesting in the context of where the CRC for water sensitive city sits today. One of the things that I think is sets quite a good foundation for this product itself and a number of the other tools and outputs from the program is the support elements that are around it. So there is actually a very large suite of information associated with the documentation of the products, both the research outputs to give you confidence in where it actually is, and then also in the understanding of how you actually can use it and apply it. Because if we actually look at it at the moment, we are a small group within a larger industry, and the larger industry will have very limited understanding of where the product sits at the moment. Having these tools in place at the moment at the end of the CRC and going forward for the Institute to actually take these products forward actually allows them to support the adoption of these products. And that's really critical in getting the value out of the investments that we've all both individually and corporately have actually applied to the products, not just in the dollars that have been spent, but actually in the time and the effort, the passion that have been applied into these products. This support and training is readily available, and if you haven't actually had a look at any of it, I'd welcome you to go onto the website and actually have a look at that. Down the track, there is opportunities for further expansion of the product, I see. If I was to have a wish list, and some of it aligns with what was actually some of the earlier and original intents of the product, was bringing in some other components that'll actually add extra layers. So we talked about a few layers associated with urban development, the heat, the water cycle. What are bringing closer in the economics component? So at the moment you can take the outputs and then you bring it into another tool. There's other component around the stormwater analysis. The intention at one point was associated with incorporating better integrations with the products, the likes of SWIM, flood modelling tools such as 2Flow or the like. Bringing those sort of overlays that are actually really important to the decision-making processes for communities. They may be associated with vulnerable communities from a biophysical perspective or associated with a risk perspective. And these are things that actually all overlay our decision-making process. And they would actually really benefit in future development. And obviously, adoption of any product, not the least of which is driven by individual champions and corporate champions to actually take the products forward. But it's also associated with how we actually set up frameworks that actually can support that, whether that be policies, guidelines, legislation that actually support these. So I'd encourage anybody in those spaces, whether it's adoption, to give the products a go, if it's in that policy or legislative space, to actually look at what are the avenues that can be taken forward. And just finally, there's multiple sets of information that's available to be used, and I will encourage you to actually have a look at those. The product is available at that website link, but I think that there's going to be a talk about the broader platform, which will actually link to the scenario tool itself. Thank you.
My role, I guess, today has really been to sort of take the recent seminar series that Chris has run and transform that into a presentation. So it covers all the workshops that encumbered the series, and I guess it sort of translated the outcomes from those into something which we could then sort of turn into diagrams and sort of relay our information in a clear manner. So I'll just start off. Okay, so the recent seminar series targeted greenfield urban settings in southeast Queensland to explore, test and implement water-sensitive city approaches. Project outcomes, I guess, can be applied to all greenfield urban settings to create attractive developments that are cooler, have lower water demands, less stormwater runoff and less pollutants, and that can demonstrate strong economic benefits for applying water-sensitive city approaches. Okay, the seminar series sort of ran for a year. The workshop started in September 2019 and through to 2020. So there was 4 in total, and the main aim was really to inspire and engage diverse professionals across industry, to showcase the latest technology and practice, and also to raise awareness, again, for best practice water-sensitive cities design. The first workshop, Achieving Livability for Growing Cities, the key focus on this one was biophysical aspects of the world's best practice water-sensitive street. Chris obviously introduced it and got the ball rolling. Then we had presentations from Rob and Luke on water-sensitive approaches at Yarrabilba. We had, I think, 40 participants in that first workshop, and then they were asked to then sketch the key attributes of your street using IWM and UHI mitigation strategies. These were aligned to 2 sort of common themes, being streets. I guess the main thing was that people really demanded better outcomes from their streets. They need to change the restrictive standards and change thinking towards water-sensitive city approaches. Some of the key things then were sort of wider verges to allow additional shade trees, ground covers and community gardens, include passive water street trees, co-locate services, increase pervious fraction, and blur the boundary. So this theme was common through all the workshops. The lot group, I guess theirs was a little bit broader. They sort of thought that all, water-sensitive city approaches need to be applied to all different types of development. Again, it's about reducing footprints to increase pervious fraction and also collect and reuse rainwater. So the translation, what that meant for a happy street was we need to increase verge area to reduce temperatures and to enhance amenity. Services need to be reconsidered to free up space for green functions. We need to convert to passively watered street trees and so on. And I guess all these things are about sort of supporting methods that result in lower urban heat. Okay, moving on to the next workshop. This one was quite a good workshop because we got a few different topics that sort of changed people's perspectives a little bit. The presentation I thought from Adrian Volters was great because his economic frameworks for blue and green infrastructure sort of touched on quite a few different aspects which we don't really sort of consider in, everyday things. And then sort of to back that up, then it was really about Reggie from Lendlease then telling us about how you then sell the blue and green at the sales office at Yarrabilba. So I guess sort of the key outcomes then were sort of for the blue and green infrastructure, it's recognising the need for multifunction open spaces for stormwater, recreation, environmental function and amenity, linking green streets to natural corridors, and then creating and delivering effective public transport networks. And then also the shared common facilities for rainwater harvesting and whatnot at the bigger scale. Reggie's kind of presentation got us to thinking about what Yarrabilba is all about, and it's about affordability. It's selling green credentials for those people, like through schemes such as the Green Star Communities program. But what that does, it sort of builds community advocacy and reasons for people wanting to buy into a particular area and understanding what they value. And then this sort of starts to then transition through into incentives for individual households and the potential to reduce council rates and lower running costs through various different methods. The other really good thing which we were introduced to from Adrian Volters was the funding schemes to deliver some of these things, and that was sort of the take-up from investor agencies such as superannuation companies and banks and in sort of investor champions. So again, what's this mean for a happy street? Yes, the sustainability thing about sort of general improvements across all the baseline sort of categories, but then it's about building knowledge, creating good leadership examples, incentives for people to buy in, and then just expecting that to become the social norm. Okay, into the meaty bit, this is where Workshop 3 started to translate all these things into something that we could actually design around. What was really good about this, we had a presentation from Dylan and he took us through the water sensitives tool to get everyone's thinking about this heat island effect and why we really need to sort of implement these changes. The other really important thing about this Workshop 3 was it was right at the start of COVID. and it was sort of implementing sort of a design sort of studio workshop across the country. So for us who are helping present and collect the data, it was an interesting challenge, but I think we got there in the end, and we got some really good outputs from it. I've just combined the sort of outputs from the attached housing and detached housing groups. So again, common themes, streets as linear parklands, adjusting building setbacks, which is something which I don't think had really come out previously, and that was really looking about sort of both sides of the street and drawing on sort of solid orientation to try and get the maximum benefit. Building scale and form, again, about reducing footprints, and then the others are sort of rainwater tanks and water-sensitive urban design. How this translated then into the graphics that we presented. This sort of also built on the work undertaken for the IRP4 built form models, but really it was about sort of exploring other ways to sort of reduce hard surfaces. I think a really good outcome we had there was the combining driveways to try and minimise sort of hard areas, rainwater tanks on all things, and just incorporating good passive design. Where we went to then, I think, for individual houses, which is probably important in the Yarra context, is really looking at sort of both sides of the street, and this is where we started to explore the use of private open space, where that should be positioned to gain the most benefit. In this particular example, it's on the southern side of the street, so you're looking at the property to the front boundary, where you could possibly gain the most space valuable for the person living in that property. And what that did is just like on solar orientation, therefore on the rear of the property is all dark and it's not that utilised, so it's about getting people into their front yards. I think there's one change I would make on this diagram is really sort of location of the footpath. I do think that should have been on the other side of the street. If people are using their front yards, you typically like to, I think, have people not looking in from the street, but that's just sort of one thing. And then on the northern side of the street, I guess it's building in all that sort of IP which we've learnt previously, sort of building sort of these backyard corridors, getting planting in the backyards, but then also widening the verge in the front yard, pushing back fences to the property frontage, and then drawing on that additional space which you can plant trees and maximise, I guess, the water function of the street. Then moving on to the next group, precinct-wide sort of outputs. This one's sort of high-level thinking, drawing on all the usual suspects, rethinking traditional processes, linking green networks. What this group did come up with was the idea then of exploring particular streets where you could potentially widen the traditional sort of lower order street to enable you to connect to green spaces. And so what it did, it broke up the urban form a little bit more than what I think was there previously, which led to sort of better outcomes and creating environments where people would like to walk. The next group, the streetscape group, I think the outcomes from this group were quite interesting, and we started to explore weaving the street and identifying additional surface area where you could remove the road and put in more garden and green space and plant additional street trees. There's project examples of this already out there, but I think this is something which really needs to be taken on board. Some of the great benefits, slowing down traffic, but also building great things for water-sensitive urban design. So again, some diagrams about what they are. So the widened street, which was the linking street, which is the blue streets. So that's the diagram. I don't even know how to work that, but this particular diagram. So that was looking at just trying to utilise another sort of couple of metres in the front street verge, and then putting footpaths on the widened verge side, and then planting additional street trees down that edge. And then the second example of the weaving the street, what that does and look and how you can provide additional street coverage and to reduce sort of the sunlight into hard surfaces and the benefits of that. Okay, moving, I think this is the last example, is the commercial one. So this is looking then in sort of, I guess, a retail sort of format, and this is really about sort of gaining the best sort of site orientation and use of space, drawing on sort of the northern sun again and shade to create spaces ideal for seating and using outdoor areas. And then deep planting zones to sort of, I guess, encourage healthy tree growth. Where was go there? So we also incorporate green roofs, although probably it's an expensive option, but certainly something which is worth investigating. Okay, so the diagram which we produced for that, it shows sort of, I guess, like the increased sort of use of trees on the street edge, shading for that western side. And again, sort of emphasis around that sort of outdoor area. We could have larger trees to shade and create amenity and somewhere desirable to go in the heat. And then the final workshop was really just reviewing some of those things that we had created, the diagrams. Again, Dylan took us through, I guess, another iteration of that tool, and that was followed up with Kim with the economic sort of backing up what we had done. So we reviewed the diagrams, and I guess there was a little bit of kickback from the Lend-Lease team saying that they didn't wish to sort of lose that additional 2 extra metres in their streetscape for saleable area. They thought that you could basically achieve a similar outcome by improving your landscape within a street as opposed to sort of just doing it like we've suggested. The other sort of pushback was from the shared driveway scenario. They thought that the particular, I guess the market out there, people preferred to have their own independent driveway, and that was because people were using their garages for storage and all sorts of other silly reasons, but certainly something that could be sort of taken up in other spaces or other places. Where we went to then was we spoke about the implementation pathways. How can we make some of this happen? So this was more just like I guess a group discussion, and we all recognised that the resistance from service providers to alter current standards. However, we thought that if people got together, we could figure out ways to make common trenching and agreement to try and free up space for additional street tree planting. We saw this as being non-problematic because the street's never dug up anyhow, and modern day, I guess, surveying can certainly identify where these services are all located. The great thing from Lend-Lease was that they were willing to actually put themselves out there and potentially take a pilots program on. So I guess that's kind of where this thing may move to now, Chris. And then finally, just sort of the next layer on top of this is the state government's thinking around street trees and the need for them to increase their, I guess, planting to every 15 metres. And then I guess in summary, I think Chris's statement again, it's water sensitive Yarrabilba would be cooler, have lower water demands with less water runoff, with less pollutants, and that there is a strong economic benefit for applying this approach. Implementation of new approaches was considered challenging, and to bring about these changes would require a whole of government approach with meaningful industry collaboration. Great, thanks.
All right, so first of all, any questions for Nathan from the audience? You just see some of the record strategies for the Oh, okay, right. So, any questions from the floor for Nathan? Okay, any questions from the floor that you might have thought about for any of the presenters? Come on, someone must have something. Okay, yes, thank you. Well done, Greg.
Thanks, Tony. I think it was Steve who said one of the most enjoyable things he did was the ideas for workshop. Was that right? Just seemed to me some of the things, the later presentations was it was a sort of a, I don't know, modern day version's not quite right, but anyway, an evolution of the whole ideas for workshops that were done very early in the CRC. So is this the new approach to ideas for? Any speaker can answer that.
Well, do any of the speakers want to answer that?
I think the collaboration.
Nathan?
I think getting as many voices and from different industries around a table to have a conversation certainly achieves great outcomes. I think when that does occur, you certainly push boundaries, think of things that you didn't think of before, and you come up with really, really great outcomes. So,
for those of you out there, Sally's coming to the mic.
Yeah. Those ideas for sort of workshops early on, I was involved in the ideas for South Bank. I think we're a great platform to bring those stakeholders together from really broad networks to just put ideas out there. Well, what could be achieved? What would we like to see? And I think just putting those ideas out there really early on then helps to say, well, what do we need to actually be able to carry some of these things forward? And I think some of these tools that have since developed can actually, and technologies can help actually deliver forward some of those ideas. So we can now, it would be great to actually go back and revisit some of those ideas and say, well, what now can we implement or explore further and in more depth now that we've got these tools available, and take them forward.
Thank you, Sally. An interloper wants to come and make a comment. Come on, Stephen, over to you. And then I will close the session after you.
I think you said anyone could come.
I did.
From my understanding, because I unfortunately couldn't get to any of the happy streets, they had a bit of alcohol as part of them, or some drinks, and as part of the workshops, and I think that's definitely a good thing. But I also wanted to say that how we design our cities and their associated infrastructure is only limited by our creativity. So I think we do need models that evolve. I've been fortunate to be involved with and lead with a thing we call the Design Challenge at UQ, which stems from a water and energy planning tournament, which we ran in the United States, an international project. And what we do is bring teams together to compete for alternative designs and to compress together with Paola. There's a number of people here have been part of them. And what you see inevitably is that so the teams compete over 2 days 5 days now, to look at how they would respond to challenges around future climate or site constraints, etc. And then they've got to market it, and then they get a bit like survivor mode, vote on the designs. And so you have this sort of creative response, and then you've got to respond to, well, how did we do this energy efficiently? And it's just incredible what they come up with, and with Brian McIntosh, build them in Lego. And then, so I think where we could go, what you see when different groups come together, if you put a whole lot of technologists together, technology is the solution. Put a whole lot of consultants together, need a whole lot more studies. You put a lot of government, workers together, you need a whole lot more policy or regulatory shift or whatever. So they all have a different, which is part of the solution. But I guess when you put together diverse teams, they genuinely compete. So I guess I just wanted to say, I think the Happy Street's a fantastic direction, but then also to recognise that in this age of COVID, we need much better digital collaboration, digital online placemaking, places where teams can come together and work digitally, not just come here and participate in the forum. So I think, yes, definitely to answer Greg's question, but there's a wide range of possibility.
Good. Thank you, Stephen. All right, that's got me thinking. Competition, alcohol and survivor mode. Any bloody thing could happen there, couldn't it? Look, I'd like to thank the 4 presenters. Sorry? We do, yeah, being a consultant, I take umbrage at that one too, Stephen. I could make a joke about academics, but I won't, because there's no point, we've all heard them. I'd like to thank the 4 presenters for being on time, for giving such great presentations, and for assisting, I think, in raising the bar in terms of the application of the water-sensitive cities tools in Queensland. Let's hope the journey can continue, and that is a very good segue to my colleague, Mr. Tanner, who's going to talk about the future, hopefully. Sorry, this is not Mr. Tanner from Bly Tanner. This is Mr. Tanner.
Yeah, that's right. There was a slip earlier on. Whilst Bly Tanner was something I loved, it's not something I'm financially involved with at all these days.
You got to get a Mac.
Yeah. Yep. So we're just about at the end, both the end of the sort of conference proceedings for today. What? Well, I have. It's here on the screen. I'll keep talking. Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, we're just about at the end of today's conference proceedings, so I'm not going to be too much longer because I know we're all probably heard enough. We're also just about at the end of the CRC Water Sensitive Cities. It is finished on the 30th of June. Today is the final conference, and tomorrow with the national series and training the following day. And so effectively things are going to wind down from here. It's been a tremendous journey, I think, for many of us, for all of us here. Personally, it's been fascinating coming from consulting to this space about influencing, working much more broadly, taking on a whole lot of different ideas and so on. And I feel eternally blessed to have been part of that. So thanks to everybody for just for actually having me here doing what I thought everybody should have a go at some stage or other. I'm going to talk very briefly, having talked about two ends, the conference and the CRC, talk about a beginning. Okay. Oh, there's no notes. Yeah, don't worry about that. So look, we're thinking here, and this has come, I'm going to talk about something we're calling the Water Collaborative. I think the name is pretty apt. It's about water, it's about collaborating. The CRC finishes, there is going to be a bid for a new CRC, which will be led by UQ and Griffith. Mark and others will be very much part of that. But that won't start at, the time frame for that is, assuming it's successful, probably kicking off towards the end of 2022. So we need something to, in the meantime. We've heard a lot about the problem today. I'm not going to dwell on that. Growth, scarcity of water, climate change, a whole bunch of things. I think critically here, this need for a group that can bring us all together and keep doing what we've been doing over the last 9 years and the last 4 years, particularly through the adoption process of the CRC. So we have this need for sort of bridging industry and research. I think that's really clear, just even in the comments that have come from Tony and Stephen, this sort of rivalry between consultants and academia. There's no rivalry at all, and in fact there's huge strength in bringing them together and bringing them together with the industry players like the utilities, the state government and their agencies, and the community. There's some really good community practice models. Pete leads one of those already with the flood community practice. We want a sort of a broader one which is about water, and I think that's again a need. So that's what we've got to do. We've got to leverage those skills that we have out there. We've got to further policy government agendas. Government policy agendas. I get that the right way around. It's obviously getting late in the day. But there's so much more we can do, and I think we've heard about that already today. And it's all about integrating land and water and how we work with that. Very briefly, this got to love a Venn diagram, hey. There's a bunch of things here that I think the Water Collaborative can do. First, the water community of practice. Second, projects that are driven by industry need, that are bringing together research and industry practice to solve complex problems. We all play a role in that, whatever part we're in, whether we are in government, consulting, research. I think the key here, and something the Water Collaborative can do, is help tackle some of those complex problems. And we've done some of that over the last few years already. So it's about an organisation that can keep doing that. And then I've already talked about the community of practice. But I really want to emphasise here the need to work with complementary groups. There's a whole raft of those. There's the Queensland Water Modelling Network, Flood Community of Practice, Healthy Land and Water. There's others there, and I'll come to a particular one in a moment. And I see that doing the sort of normal things of community practice, events, networking, modelling forums, capacity building. There's a whole lot of value we can bring there. Just those leveraged partner skills, independence and trust is something that came out through the CRC time and time again. If that position of independence, that position of trust to solve problems, and in garnering those skills across all those organisations for informed opinion and innovation. Just very briefly on perhaps how that looks, we see the Water Collaborative having a group of members, which will be fairly broad, and a group that's perhaps more intimately involved, more financially involved, which I've called the sponsors. University of Queensland, and particular Advanced Water Management Centre, has already put up their hand and said they would host that, and a few people here already have said they will back it. There's a big range of complementary organisations. Water Sensitive Cities Institute is something that has already exists. It was set up by the CRC for water sensitive cities as a limited company, proprietary limited company, a little while ago, and they will actually hold all the IP that exists from the work of the CRC water sensitive cities, and they'll have a significant presence in Victoria. So I think the Water Collaborative, it's incumbent on us and the Institute to work really closely together, very much leveraging the skills of the two organisations. That's enough on that. Well, nearly enough. We've got a draft prospectus. Some of you have seen it. That needs to be socialised a little bit more. We've got ongoing discussions amongst potential sponsors. We need to go to the next level in the discussions with the Institute about how that works. Drinks are getting closer. Before we go there, again, a bit sort of the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning. We've got a new website.